Every day, we make decisions, form opinions, and even judge others, often without realizing how much influence the world around us has on our thinking. That's the power of social psychology. It reveals the hidden forces shaping our behavior. In this crash course, I've invited Dr. Sophia Lane, a specialist in psychology, to guide you through 25 carefully designed lessons. Together, we'll explore the theories, experiments, and insights that explain why we act the way we do, and how understanding these patterns can change the way you see people, relationships, and even yourself. Let's begin.
What is social psychology? Social psychology is enthralling. With plenty of unanswered problems comes a number of hypotheses about human behavior and why we make specific decisions, judgments, or comparisons. This video will provide you with an overview of social psychology and its impact on the globe. I'll go over the history of social psychology, the major theories, and the studies that helped form it into what it is today. So first and foremost, what exactly is social psychology? Let's begin with a quick overview of social psychology. It is the study of how people behave and interact with one another in various contexts. This field, psychologists think that all behavior occurs in a social environment. We can begin to grasp the inner workings of the mind and why certain decisions are made by looking at society's influence on the individual. Like many historical crises, the latest pandemic brings out the best and worst in people. You may come across stories on the internet about people selflessly giving up their time, money, or lives to aid others. But you may also come across stories of people who exhibit blatant disrespect for the truth, or even the lives of others. The people around us have had a huge influence on the decisions we have had to make during this pandemic. A young, healthy person may choose to self-isolate, for example, to preserve the herd rather than themselves. You undoubtedly had a lot of questions about human behavior while you were locked up in quarantine, as I did. These extreme circumstances frequently raise questions about our nature and how we function as a society. And these are not new questions. Social psychologists have been striving to address them for decades. So let's go over some social psychology history. Since the ancient Greeks, psychologists and philosophers have been concerned with the impact of society on the person. For example, Aristotle highlighted the significance of a state or political society in an individual's survival. He also felt that human language and rules distinguished us from other animals, and that some of these laws outlined everyone's various tasks in order to foster a successful economy. However, Aristotle did not perform experiments in the same way that psychologists do today. This method of theory validation was not widely used in social psychology until the late 1800s. A few psychologists had written on the influence of society on human behavior at this point, but they didn't have the facts to back it up. Hey everyone, it's Knowle, your gateway to understanding human behavior and emotions. Join us for fascinating insights. Hit subscribe for a part of our journey through the exciting field of psychology. In 1895, one of the earliest studies in social psychology as we know it today took place. An experiment was carried out by Norman Triplett, an American psychologist at Indiana University, in which youngsters wound up a fishing rod. Some children finished the activity alone, while others worked with other youngsters. He discovered that youngsters who were among their friends were more driven to accomplish the assignment quickly. And thus, the concept of social facilitation theory was established. Social psychology became popular in the early 1900s, but it truly took off later in the century. In America, world wars and the Great Depression sparked many questions about society and its impact on unique individuals. Many social psychologists' work was also influenced by racial prejudice. In the 1960s and 1970s, darker and more disturbing tests on human behavior led psychologists to reconsider the process of conducting experiments and how to approach social psychology responsibly. And the research has spread far beyond the limits of the United States. Today, global research and impact continue to shape social psychology and how it is approached. There's still so much to learn. Let us now look at the fundamental beliefs of social psychology. As a result, the fundamental ideas of social psychology address more than only how humans interact with one another. They also explain how to collect data and watch people in order to develop hypotheses in social psychology. So here are some of the key ideas that have shaped social psychology and continue to be at the heart of this discipline. Number 1, society has a tremendous influence on people's behavior and decision-making. Even if a decision is taken privately, society has an impact on the individual. Even if no one is looking and they know they will not be caught, a person may not choose to steal. They are just impacted by the laws that society has established. Number 2, experiments can be carried out to support hypotheses. As a result, social psychology is regarded as predictable and testable. Psychologists are expected to test their hypotheses several times and measure the results objectively to support or refute their position. This process is changing as psychologists learn what it means to be objective. In fact, some notable experiments have been dismissed due to researcher prejudice. It is an ongoing process. Third, behavior is used to evaluate someone's personality and character. You've probably heard the saying, actions speak louder than words. In social psychology, actions speak volumes. A few social psychology theories investigate how we analyze another person's activities and how this impacts our perception of that person. These types of examinations are also used to make judgments about our personality and character. And interestingly, because we can't actually know what someone is thinking, we can only look at their behaviors. And we can sometimes ask them, but it's not always accurate. Finally, we have certain goals can be achieved through behavior. Yes, our society influences our behavior and actions, but these decisions are all made to achieve a specific objective. This could be to meet a physical need or to achieve a certain social position. And if you study more about social psychology, particularly their most famous theories and research, you'll see that these 4 core notions appear repeatedly. Let's talk about some of the most well-known theories and names in social psychology. So the first one I'll mention is something called Attribution Theory. So why did your best friend tell you a lie? Or why did you overtake that person in traffic? And why would a billionaire give up their wealth for a more austere way of life? Every day, you must make hundreds of judgments. You make some of these decisions alone, some in front of others. And occasionally, you witness other people's conduct and make judgments about why they made their decisions. Attribution theory examines how we watch other individuals and explains how others make judgments. We are, after all, meaning-making creatures. We want to know why someone made certain decisions or what elements they consider to influence their behavior. So the 2 basic categories within attribution theory are external influences, such as money, weather, and what they're wearing, and internal factors, such as their inner beliefs or insecurities. In summary, attribution theory seeks to explain how we see others when they make judgments. Following that, we have self-perception theory. So, attribution theory examines how we observe and judge the behavior of others, whereas self-perception theory examines how we observe and judge our own behavior. And how we perceive ourselves is critical to the goals we believe we can attain, our mental health, and how our lives unfold. Following that, we have social identity theory. So you may see yourself as someone who is humorous, accomplished, and courageous, but you may also see yourself as a student or an actress who lives in New York. As a result, you may identify as a New Yorker, a student, or an actress. And your identity, in turn, may influence how you make decisions or present yourself to others. This is the essence of social identity theory. This theory investigates the method by which people identify themselves and others. We frequently observe people in in-groups or out-groups, and depending on your position, you may observe people who are similar to you in one light and people who are different from you in another. Following that, we have cognitive dissonance theory. As a result, when people engage in groups, they are certain to have opposing viewpoints. But what happens when we learn new information that contradicts previous knowledge? According to cognitive dissonance theory, This contradiction can be extremely difficult for people to bear. Indeed, some psychologists believe it creates worry. Our minds struggle to absorb and interpret this contradictory information. If we aren't aware of our discomfort, we often dismiss fresh facts and stick to our gut instinct. And believe me, we see this all the time while discussing politics at the dinner table or sharing stories on social media. People simply want to keep believing what they believe. One final issue and theory I'd like to discuss is evolutionary psychology. So why do we perceive others the way we do? Is it because of the culture in which we grew up? Or are our perceptions, language, and social interactions simply the outcome of evolution? And it is to this question that evolutionary psychology seeks an answer. This psychology technique has been around since the late 1800s. Natural selection, as proposed by Charles Darwin, has had a significant impact on evolutionary psychology. And while it used to be on the outskirts of psychology, evolutionary psychology is now becoming more mainstream. This demonstrates that, while certain ideas in social psychology appear to be timeless, others will gain and lose appeal. The 5 ideas I've outlined are only a small part of the field of social psychology. Other theories and concepts are social learning theory, cognitive biases, schemas, social comparison, and social exchange theory. There's something called the triangular theory of love, and don't forget about the bystander effect. So social psychology is concerned with more than only why humans make good judgments and follow the norms, because many of the ideas and experiments in this subject aim to address concerns regarding why humans do bad things. Many of social psychology's most famous or infamous experiments occurred in the years following World War II. How could people be capable of such atrocities? How can we avoid the attitudes and behaviors that gave rise to Nazism? So I'm going to go over some of these classic studies quickly. You may be familiar with these experiments and their impact on the world of psychology if you've seen some of my other videos. So first up is the Bobo doll experiment, which is one of the most renowned experiments in psychology and contributed to the development of the social learning theory. Children were placed in a room with an adult, an inflatable Bobo doll, and other items for the Bobo doll experiment. Some of these grown-ups were violent with this doll, while others ignored it or were gentle with it. Psychologists discovered that children who witnessed adults being hostile were more likely to be aggressive themselves. This demonstrated that youngsters can learn by modeling or observing the behaviors of others. The Stanford prison experiment comes next. The Stanford prison experiment is perhaps the most well-known. In fact, you can watch a film about it on Netflix. The experiment placed college-aged boys in a mock prison, with half of the group acting as guards and the other half acting as inmates. Guards and convicts rapidly assumed their respective positions, and both grew vicious. The project was actually called off after only 6 days. This experiment intended to demonstrate how rapidly labels and positions may affect a person, even in a simulated setting. The Milgram experiment is another well-known experiment. So why do we occasionally make dubious decisions? We're only doing what we're instructed because we're following orders. In the 1960s, Stanley Milgram conducted an experiment in which volunteers were trained to deliver electric shocks to participants who had no idea they were actors, at voltages of up to 450 volts. However, the researchers trained the individuals to administer the shocks. Surprisingly, several individuals actually provided the shocks, despite their discomfort. They still carried out orders. Milgram's experiment, like the Stanford prison experiment, is remembered as a notable and potentially harmful experiment to the participants who administered the shocks. However, it does provide an explanation for why people commit crimes or make unethical actions. As I near the end of this video, you should be aware that this is only the top of the iceberg. There is much more to the scientific subject known as social psychology. After all, it's been debated since Aristotle's day. This field will continue to evolve, particularly as the globe confronts new issues and develops new technologies. Many social psychology studies, for example, focus on social media. However, social media was not even a concept 30 years ago. So take the time to master the fundamentals of social psychology and amass a library of information on how society affects individuals, you might discover something new about yourself, your culture, or how the people around you perceive the world. What does it feel like to be a sports fan and witness someone wearing your team's jersey? Doesn't that feel good? What if you encounter someone wearing a hoodie from the college you attended? You always have something to talk about because of psychology. Perhaps you're traveling abroad and come across someone wearing a hat that proclaims they're from the United States or even your hometown. It's natural to feel more at ease and trustworthy when you know someone like you is nearby. But what if you run into someone from a rival sports team? Why do these feelings occur? Why are we more likely to trust someone based just on their sports team membership, hometown, or other comparable factors? Why do we dread or distrust persons who do not belong to these groups? Hey everyone, it's Knowle, your gateway to understanding human behavior and emotions. Join us for fascinating insights. Hit subscribe for a part of our journey through the exciting field of psychology. One explanation is the concept of in-group bias. This video discusses in-group prejudice and how it might affect our judgment when judging people, allocating resources, or making decisions. This can be a difficult subject to broach, especially when it affects specific groups such as persons of a given race, ethnicity, or gender. However, I believe that only by properly understanding our hidden prejudices will we be able to overcome them and build a more equitable world for all. First and foremost, what is the in-group bias? In-group prejudice, also known as in-group partiality, is a bias in which people prefer others who belong to similar groups to themselves. Gender, race, ethnicity, hair color, or even a favorite sports team could form these groups. We prefer to favor those who are similar to us and belong to our groups because of the in-group bias. However, in-group prejudice is more than just views and preferences. We are also more prone to act in ways that benefit in-group members. On the negative side, this means that we are more prone to look down on people who do not belong to our groups. But I'll go into more detail about this in my video on outgroup bias. When you turn on the news today, you can easily detect in-group prejudice. It is not one of the most obscure concepts in the field of social psychology. In-group bias is also not a distinct notion. A few different hypotheses support the concept of in-group bias. The social identity theory is one of these theories. After completing a series of research on how humans establish groups and our distinct identities, Henry Tadfel coined the phrase in the 1970s. This theory divides the process of forming an identity into three parts: categorization, identification, and comparison. We compare our groupings to other groups and ourselves to persons in those other groups during the comparison stage. It may come as no surprise that when we make these comparisons, we frequently favor ourselves and those in our in-groups. Generalized reciprocity is another theory that supports the idea of in-group bias but exists outside of the realm of social psychology. Generalized reciprocity is a concept found in both economics and anthropology. Reciprocity happens when one person exchanges goods and services for another, similar to when you buy your friend coffee as a treat with the unspoken agreement that they might get the next one in the future. Reciprocity is most likely to occur in our most intimate in-groups. We can rely on our relatives and close friends to get us coffee later. Further research has attempted to determine when people begin to exhibit in-group prejudice. The answer isn't always obvious, but one study found that boys as young as 3 years old could exhibit in-group prejudice. It is crucial to understand that in-group bias is not a fixed mindset. Other research indicates that people may exhibit more or less in-group bias as a result of external variables. In one study, men showed in-group bias toward members from the same political party during some stages of the election cycle, but not others. Their prejudices may have had little to do with biology or neuroscience. Instead, the presence of tension or conflict may have had a greater impact. Let us now discuss some of the advantages of in-group bias. Consider the sports jersey example I provided at the start of this video. You might look at a complete stranger wearing that jersey and naturally grin or nod. According to one study, When participants witnessed comparable sports fans being harmed, they were more inclined to feel empathy, even if they didn't know the supporters personally. This is important in social psychology because we are more ready to aid those in our in-groups, even if they owe us nothing and we have never met them before. In fact, this form of connecting is essential for our health. Belonging, or a sensation of belonging, is included as a base-level psychological need in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It is immediately above necessities such as food, drink, safety, and shelter. We feel a sense of belonging once we identify members from our in-group. We feel trusted and valued in return because we naturally trust and appreciate our in-group members. We get a burst of endorphins just by seeing someone wearing a sports jersey, a college sweater, or an American flag hat. Unfortunately, there must be an outgroup if there is an in-group. Our proclivity to act in ways that favor the in-group may result in us taking resources away from the outgroup. This concept can be traced back to social identity theory, which may have evolved from basic demands to live on scarce resources. People may exclude others in outgroups by seizing or distributing resources such as food, housing, or jobs based on in-group bias. There are numerous examples of this procedure available. This is why programs such as affirmative action and low-income housing exist. This is why there is such a heated debate in the country over the income disparity between men and women. Historically, our country's leaders have mostly been members of one in-group: white, straight, wealthy men. It's no surprise that the majority of leaders are at the top of the food chain and are often white, straight, wealthy men. However, as we begin to confront in-group bias and its role in our society, we may begin to see changes in our leadership and resource distribution. If there is one thing we can learn from studying in-group prejudice, it is that we can better comprehend it. Hopefully, by better understanding it, we can create a more free and equitable society. Consider your favorite sports team or the university where you earned your degree. Now consider a rival sports team or a rival college. It doesn't take long for your thoughts to turn sour, and anytime you take a step back, remind yourself that not all supporters of that team or alumni of that school are necessarily awful people. However, your first instinct may be to roll your eyes at them. Why is this so? And why are we so angry toward a certain group of people who are not our own? Hey everyone, it's Knowle, your gateway to understanding human behavior and emotions. Join us for fascinating insights. Hit subscribe for a part of our journey through the exciting field of psychology. Social psychologists, anthropologists, and even economists have proposed a solution. The in-group, out-group bias is a cognitive bias that we all have. I recommend seeing my video on in-group biases if you haven't already. It undoubtedly provides additional examples and studies that demonstrate our natural preference for those who are members of our in-groups. However, in this video, we'll be discussing the out-group bias. So what exactly is the out-group bias? We establish groups for a variety of reasons. As an example, we can think of men as one group and women as another. We might classify white people as one group and black people as another. We might classify University of Texas fans as one group and OU fans as another. Many social psychologists feel that our group separation and social identity building lead to a preference for one group over another. A person is far more inclined to view those who belong to the organizations to which they belong favorably. A UT fan, for example, is considerably more inclined to view other UT supporters favorably. Outgroup bias, on the other hand, demonstrates the flip side of the coin. A UT fan is more inclined to belittle OU fans or fans of opposing sports teams. This notion also implies that, in addition to liking people in our in-groups, we are more prone to withholding resources or acting against the out-group's demands. But why is this so? According to social psychologists, it dates back to more primitive times when people were struggling for scarce resources. They were fighting for their lives, for basic necessities like food, water, and shelter. And if your in-group controlled the food, water, and shelter, you'd have a better chance of getting the resources you needed to survive. Obviously, you want to help your group. However, if the outgroup came and took those resources away from you, you might not be eaten or have a place to sleep. Primitive thinking drives us to avoid the outgroup at all costs. Let's look at some examples of outgroup bias because attitude is still at the heart of in-group outgroup bias. Consider the phenomenon of xenophobia. One typical objection to immigration is that individuals do not want immigrants to take jobs away from Americans. As a result, they portray immigrants negatively and even support border security legislation. Let us now delve deeper into one of the most well-known psychology tests, known as the blue eyes, brown eyes experiment. Jane Elliott was the one who performed the renowned blue eyes, brown eyes experiment. Jane Elliott worked as a teacher in the 1960s. She divided her third-grade class based on their eye color. She would declare the blue-eyed group to be superior on the first day. Then she would tell the brown-eyed group how inferior they were and point out their flaws while praising the blue-eyed group. She would later exchange roles. While the activity was intended to teach her pupils about the impacts of racism, it quickly gained national attention, and a documentary on the exercise demonstrated exactly how quickly the youngsters turned on the outgroup. A comparable experiment a few years later became renowned as one of the country's most notorious psychological studies, the Stanford jail experiment. It cast 24 college-age lads in the roles of either a prisoner or a guard. The guards were granted the authority to handle the prisoner any way they saw fit, as long as they did not hit them. The convicts were told to obey. This shows how quickly everything went wrong. Again, volunteers who had never met before the study and had never served time in jail suddenly turned on each other. Within a few days, the inmates organized and mounted a revolt against the guards. Due to the violence and potential psychological harm on the subjects, the experiment was discontinued after 6 days. I'll go into more detail about this experiment in a subsequent video, but it demonstrates how powerful in-group and out-group prejudice can be on the behaviors of those in power. Outgroup homogeneity bias is a concept that is interwoven with in-group and out-group bias. According to studies, we do more than merely dislike outgroups more than we like our own. These investigations also demonstrated that we are more inclined to regard individuals of an outgroup as interchangeable, all with the same undesirable characteristics. According to the outgroup homogeneity bias, it is easier to remember individuals in an in-group rather than an out-group, partly because they all blend together. This may sound familiar if you've ever heard someone employ generalizations about one gender, ethnicity, or ethnic group. Stereotypes portray all members of one out-group as having a specific set of undesirable characteristics. When these stereotypes are deployed, they are done without identifying one person from another in the out-group. Everyone in the out-group receives the same treatment. Consider this. I tried the McDonald's on Route 291, and it sucked. As a result, I believe that all McDonald's are bad. This happens with people all the time, except instead of a restaurant, it's a religion, a race, a belief system, or even financial difficulties. Outgroup bias clearly has major implications. We may pass judgment on people before we ever meet them. We may refuse assistance to anyone only because of the color of their skin or the football team they support. To create a more equitable environment, we must be conscious of outgroup bias, which is something that all individuals, like any other cognitive bias, are guilty of. We may make more fair decisions and better judgments by being attentive to our thoughts and behaviors and realizing that our biases may be driving us astray. I hope you enjoyed this video about outgroup bias and that the examples helped you understand it a little better. Have you ever read Lord of the Flies? Many people encounter it in middle and high school. Even if you only skimmed the novel, you may recall the plot. A group of boys finds themselves stuck on a desolate island with no adult supervision. As they attempt to build some sort of community, they turn on each other in desperation, and things get violent. Now, Lord of the Flies is a standard of young adult fiction, noted for reflecting society and warning that anyone can become violent if they are desperate for insufficient resources. It was published in 1954, a year before psychologist Misattribution Sheriff was awarded $38,000 from the Rockefellers to conduct an intriguing research experiment. Hey everyone, it's Knowle, your gateway to understanding human behavior and emotions. Join us for fascinating insights. Hit subscribe for a part of our journey through the exciting field of psychology. Sheriff was weary of working with lab rats and wanted to try something different, an experiment inspired by Lord of the Flies. This experiment, long celebrated for its insights into group conflict theory, is today more infamous than famous. Regardless of its reputation, it is nevertheless one of the most famous social psychology experiments of the 20th century. Sheriff wanted to demonstrate how easily groups may turn against each other when competing for scarce resources. He also wanted to show how these parties might put aside their differences to combat a shared adversary. He conducted the experiment at his summer camp since observing these group dynamics with lab rats or canines was not possible. The 22 youngsters at Robbers Cave State Park were not aware that their summer camp experience was part of a wider social experiment. They had no idea how big the camp was until the second day. On the first day, researchers acting as counselors divided into two groups, the Eagles and the Rattlers. After bonding with their own groups, the boys were introduced to the other group. Over the next few days, the researchers organized events like baseball games and tug of war. Winners earned awards, while losers received none. Additional tensions ensued. For example, one group was given access to food while the others were instructed to wait. The lads acquired an us versus them mentality, as discussed in my videos on in-group and out-group bias. Initially, they traded threats and had verbal disagreements, which evolved into physical violence. One party destroyed the other's flag, while the other responded by raiding their cabin and seizing belongings. During this time, questionnaires revealed the boys' negative attitudes and preconceptions toward the boys in the opposing group, verifying the first element of Sheriff's argument. Sheriff, on the other hand, was not finished. The Robbers Cave experiment had entered its final phase of friction reduction. All 22 lads were assigned chores that benefited the entire group. To aid this, the researchers devised a challenge. A truck transporting food became stuck, and the boys had to work together to remove it. Another problem was constructing an assembly line to remove pebbles that were preventing access to the camp's water tower. Despite early antagonism, the guys worked together to achieve goals that benefited the entire group. The shift from conflict to shared interests is intriguing. I recall a similar situation when my parents divorced, dealing with my sister's seizures. Despite early disagreements, they banded together to support my sister. The Robbers Cave experiment served as significant evidence for Donald Campbell's realistic conflict theory, which he introduced a few years later. This idea broadened our understanding of group conflict beyond fundamental necessities like sex and food, to include larger ambitions and a wider variety of resources. According to realistic conflict theory, group conflict becomes more intense when groups fight for finite resources such as food, respect, power, or recognition. Let's move on to objections to the Robbers Cave experiment. Its problematic ethics have made it one of the most well-known but divisive experiments. The goal of an experiment is to test a theory. If the data confirm the hypothesis, the experiment was successful. Otherwise, the problem was with the hypothesis rather than the experiment itself. Given these findings, psychologists have avoided using the Robbers Cave experiment as an example in textbooks and presentations. While the initial experiment did not go as anticipated, Sheriff repeated it and obtained findings that supported his beliefs. Despite ethical difficulties, there is still evidence to support realistic conflict theory, particularly in relation to racial tensions and immigration policies. A report on opposition to school busing and integration, published in 1983, found that group conflict reasons, in addition to racism, were important. Similar arguments exist today, such as allegations that immigrants are taking jobs. The Robbers Cave experiment demonstrates that experiments should not be undertaken only to confirm a hypothesis. It emphasizes the importance of the us versus them concept. We receive a wealth of information from the minute we are born. Our parents communicate to us in a language we don't comprehend, but we ultimately learn the rules and follow them, and we see memories that become subconscious lessons. As we grow older, language becomes a means of communicating with those around us. We apply the rules we've learned to similar situations without inquiry, and our memories impact how we interpret our surroundings. But how does our brain organize all of this data? How can we readily find the guidelines for behavior at a country club and then apply them to our own behavior in comparable situations? We will use schema theory to get the answer. This video is all about schema theory, how it helps our minds function, and how something called schema changes the way we perceive the world. The more you understand about this concept known as a schema, the easier it will be to understand your mind and make sound decisions in your surroundings. Hey everyone, it's Knowle, your gateway to understanding human behavior and emotions. Join us for fascinating insights. Hit subscribe for a part of our journey through the exciting field of psychology. So first and foremost, what are schemas? It's not the easiest topic to understand without a metaphor, so imagine your mind as a filing cabinet. That filing cabinet contains everything you've ever studied, experienced, or witnessed. Every piece of information represents a schema. A schema is a framework that we can apply anytime we encounter new information and try to make sense of it. Consider a schema to be a collection of small index cards that each represent an idea. One index card schema could include all you know about Alex Trebek, while another could include everything you know about Oxford commas or restaurant etiquette. Schemas help us organize our thoughts and make it easier to refer to them when we process new information or memories. I'll explain how schemas operate later, but for now, all you need to know is that they help organize the mind. So what is the history of schema theory? Because schema is an abstract idea, there is no single psychologist who is responsible for developing schema theory, nor is there a specific portion of the brain that can be removed to impair your ability to create schema. Psychologists such as Frederick Bartlett pioneered the concept of abstract frameworks in the mind that ordered information, but no psychologist at the time knew who he was. The term schema is really attributed to John Piaget. Piaget played an important role in creating theories about how the mind operates and the process of cognitive development. He is well known for his work with children, and I've read some of his work. He became preoccupied with understanding the child's mind and how it developed. I think it's interesting that children grow the most. When we become adults, we typically stop growing. So if we can understand how that growth process works, we can use it later in life to continue growing at the same rate. Piaget studied how children create schemas and use them as building blocks. What begins as extremely simple schemas gradually becomes more complicated and begins to explain a broader set of concepts in the universe. Schemas are similar to the initial assumptions you have about life. For example, when a child attends their first birthday party, they may not have a good understanding of what happens. And via their experience at the party, as well as listening to their parents explain what is going on, they begin to form a schema, notion, or belief about what a birthday party is. Birthday parties are now classified as script schemas, or schemas that come with scripts. Other examples of script schema include ordering at a restaurant, behaving at a sporting event, or going through a breakup. There are numerous sorts of schema, including object schema, information about things, social schema, knowledge about groups of people, person schema, particular information on a single person, and role schema, information about how to behave. It's similar to wearing a mask in different contexts and having trait schema, which is information about what a specific characteristic signifies. So I believe it is critical to recognize that we, as humans, are meaning-making creatures, but our minds like to create that meaning, that purpose, with little effort. That is why the mind draws from schemas. They allow us to fill in the spaces and create a picture of a situation or person. We don't have to paint that picture every time we meet someone new or attend a birthday party. It functions similarly to autofill, but only for concepts. This saves us time and energy, but it can also result in incorrect conclusions. This is both a positive and a negative characteristic of schemas, because we've all heard some variation of this riddle. See if you can guess this. A father and son were involved in an accident. Unfortunately, the father was killed immediately, and the boy was transported to the hospital for surgery. A doctor entered the operation room, glanced at the youngster, and stated, "I can't operate on him. He's my son." Now, I'll allow you a few seconds to think about it. Most people, if they have never heard this puzzle before, are unable to accurately answer it. And it demonstrates how deeply biased our brains are when processing information. So, do you know who the doctor is yet? The answer is that the doctor is the boy's mother. Unfortunately, according to the conventional image or schema of what a doctor or surgeon is, most people do not associate the term with a woman or a mother. The image of a doctor in your mind is actually the schema that you have created for a doctor, and most people associate a doctor with a man wearing a white lab coat and a stethoscope. That is the image that comes to mind when we hear the word doctor. This is when schemas might become problematic. By relying on previous schemas, we may cut ourselves off to facts or thoughts that contradict what is on our index card of a notion. So in short, a schema can actually constrain us. Schemas that we have established in the past might form stereotypes, limiting ideas and outmoded ways of doing things. So you may be wondering, can you change your schema? Because we all know someone who is locked in their old habits. Some people believe it is impossible to change the schemas they have developed for various categories of people, how the world works, and how to behave. Well, yes and no. It is definitely possible to change your perspective on someone you may have previously judged. As you gain more experience and learn more about the world, your schema may begin to shift, and you may have a more open mind about the people you meet and the locations you visit. However, there is one caveat. You must be open to change. Finally, while you can adjust your schema, initial impressions tend to remain around. I hope you enjoyed this video on schemas, and I encourage you to watch the rest of my social psychology series to have a thorough understanding of how the human brain interacts with others. How do you define yourself? More specifically, which groups would you say you belong to? I'm not just talking about Facebook or Discord groups. I'm talking about the groups you contact with on a daily basis, the ones you feel like you belong to. You may identify as a Temple University student. We may identify as members of your close family or even as Catholics. Every group you belong to has an opposing group. There is another group out there. These are individuals who do not identify in the same way. You might refer to them as the others. Students who attend other colleges, hail from different families, or follow different beliefs. These groups, and particularly the wars between them, have molded human history. So why are we so committed to the groups to which we belong? And why does identification with one group always result in conflict with another? Many social psychologists, including Henry Tadful, have dedicated their lives to figuring out the answers to these two issues. In the late 1970s, Tadful and his team undertook a series of research that resulted in the development of the social identity theory. And this video is all about social identity theory and how it influences the decisions that individuals and organizations make. Hey everyone, it's Knowle, your gateway to understanding human behavior and emotions. Join us for fascinating insights. Hit subscribe for a part of our journey through the exciting field of psychology. As individuals, we typically progress through 3 stages and form groups, which eventually evolve into the us versus them attitude that has molded the story of human history. The 3 processes are categorization, identification, and comparison, and I'll go over each one. The first level of social identity theory is classification. You cannot belong to a group unless you are aware of its existence, which we do by observing our surroundings. It happens all the time, generally without you even realizing it. It does not take long to notice that people are separated into many groups. All you need to do is walk into a school cafeteria or listen to the news. Groups are classified according to their religion, nationality, physical abilities, and so forth. I could be here till tomorrow coming up with ways humans have classified other humans. Essentially, these are traits that distinguish people and a lot of how you define them is determined by how you were raised and where you grew up. Second, make an identification. When you begin to organize the world into separate groups, it is time to look inward. How do you identify? And there are numerous ways to answer this question. You can identify as a male, female, or non-binary individual. You may identify as a Catholic, Muslim, or Scientologist. You may identify as straight, lesbian, or pansexual. Alternatively, you can identify as none of these things. When it comes to psychology, what you identify with is virtually endless. In truth, Maslow's hierarchy of needs remains an important paradigm for understanding human behavior and what drives people to make decisions. And at the bottom of this hierarchy, the most fundamental level, there is something known as basic requirements. Before we can explore the world at large, we must feel comfortable and know where our next food will come from. And after these basic wants are met, we seek love and belonging. And we can obtain this affection and belonging just by associating with particular groups. This urge for belonging may impact how we shape ourselves to fit into that community. For example, perhaps you join a fraternity and begin wearing its letters around school. Or perhaps you become a young professional and update your clothes to match the other professionals at your workplace. A person's desire to fit in with a specific group might impact their hairstyles, fashion trends, and even where they live. Even the way we wear our hair or drive our cars indicates that we belong to a specific group. For example, I drive a Mustang, and there are a lot of individuals out there who don't drive Mustangs but constantly criticize them. But having traveled extensively, I've discovered that other Mustang owners form strong bonds with one another. For example, when we convey our identity to members in that group, we are validated and experience a necessary sense of love and belonging. For example, one of my buddies recently got a nose ring, something I wouldn't expect from him. Anyway, we went to a sensory deprivation tank, which I strongly recommend, and the cashier instantly complimented him on it. At first, I thought it was incredible how quickly they connected. They held a 20-minute talk in the foyer, but then I saw the cashier also wore a nose ring, and they were in the same gang. In summary, they identified with their nose rings, which brought them closer together. So after categorization and identification follows comparison. So why do we receive this form of validation by making our identities more obvious? It's because the final stage of the social identity theory is comparison, which is when the us against them mentality begins to emerge. One of Henry Tadful's tests on the social identity theory requested participants to compare and evaluate persons from various groups, and they were assigned a group to identify with during the experiment. Tadful's team encouraged participants to award points to other participants, and while the groups were random, they weren't organized in any meaningful way. Participants were more likely to award points to members of their group, which reflects how we compare ourselves and others to outsiders. It is in our instinct to compare and categorize. According to Yuval Noah Harari, author of one of the great books, Sapiens, Homo sapiens developed to think of humans as us and them. Us was the group closest to you, whatever you were, and them was everyone else. Early humans were not motivated by identity politics. Rather, they were motivated by limited resources such as food, water, and shelter. They may believe that members in their own group will share the riches and provide for those in their own group, but allowing them access to these restricted resources could jeopardize our entire group's survival. This mindset could explain why participants in Tadful's experiments were more willing to award points to persons from their own group. And the story is all too familiar. As I near the end of this video, I'd like to emphasize that there is much more to learn and explore with social identity theory. After all, not everyone who belongs to a group wants or chooses to be associated with that group. For example, being labeled as a convict or felon might be difficult to overcome. But I believe that is a topic for another video. Within these groupings, persons can move up or down the ranks and be classified into even smaller groups. So keep learning, listening, and researching different aspects of psychology that may bring additional insight into the concepts of identity and belonging. I hope you've learned a little bit about social identity theory. Albert Bandura's Bobo doll experiment investigated whether social behaviors might be acquired simply by seeing others in action. In the acclaimed television show Big Little Lies, emotions rise after an unknown child is accused of choking another pupil. This is a minor spoiler for the series. The youngster is revealed to be the character Max. Max has an abusive father, and when Max's mother learns her child is absorbing traits from her husband, she chooses to intervene. This cycle of abuse is heartbreaking, but it is too widespread in today's environment. Many abusers were abused or grew up in an abusive environment. These principles may appear simple, yet evidence supporting them was only recently becoming available in the mid-20th century. Hey everyone, it's Knowle, your gateway to understanding human behavior and emotions. Join us for fascinating insights. Hit subscribe for a part of our journey through the exciting field of psychology. So what is the Bobo doll experiment? Albert Bandura, a Canadian-American psychologist, carried out this experiment at Stanford in 1961. He put several youngsters in a room with an adult, some toys, and a 5-foot-tall Bobo doll. A Bobo doll is a giant inflatable clown that resembles a bowling pin. As a result, when punched or knocked down, they invariably roll upward. Anyway, this experiment established Albert Bandura as one of the most well-known psychologists in history. To this day, he is placed alongside Freud and B.F. Skinner. In this video, I will describe the Bobo doll experiments, how they altered the field of psychology, and how they continue to have an effect on us today. So let's get started by discussing Bandura's first Bobo doll experiment. In 1961, he conducted 3 separate experiments: modeling violence, arousal, and the delayed imitation test. The first stage involved modeling, and the study was divided into 3 groups, one of which served as a control group. 2 of the groups were in a room with a model who was essentially an adult. One group saw the adult punching the Bobo doll repeatedly and using harsh and abusive remarks toward the inflatable clown. Some of these models elected to strike the Bobo doll in the head with a hammer. Now, the second group did not see this behavior. They merely observed the model playing with blocks, coloring, or engaging in other non-aggressive kid hobbies. The goal here is to split the groups to observe if they are watching the models and then imitating their behaviors. The second stage is aggressive arousal. After 10 minutes in the room with the model, the youngster was brought to another room. Now, this room had a variety of appealing toys, and the researchers momentarily let the youngsters to play with them. However, as kids were playing with the toys, the researchers walked in and took them away. They then led the children into another room. It's easy to guess, and that was exactly the purpose, that the kids were frustrated. However, the researchers wanted to examine what these children would do and how they would express their dissatisfaction. This stage is known as aggressive arousal. Stage 3 is the test for delayed imitation. So the third area had a variety of aggressive and non-violent toys. The room also included the Bobo doll. The researchers observed and documented each child's conduct using a one-way mirror. You might be wondering what occurred. As you might expect, youngsters who witnessed adults beating the Bobo doll were more likely to express their irritation by hitting the Bobo doll themselves. They kicked, shouted, and even used a hammer to strike the doll in the head. One of the most noteworthy findings was that youngsters who watched non-aggressive adults were more inclined to avoid the Bobo doll and vent their frustrations without resorting to hostility or violence. And this means a lot. It means that we learn how to cope with frustration and unfavorable situations from a very young age, perhaps too young to remember. The difficulty is that no one chooses their parents, so you could be imitating either healthy or bad behavior. But let us go on. I'm going to discuss the second Bobo doll experiment. 2 years later, he conducted another experiment using a Bobo doll, this time combining modeling and conditioning, another well-known psychological concept. He wanted to see if people were actually motivated by consequences or if there was more to their actions and attitudes. In this experiment, Bandura showed youngsters a video of a model being hostile toward a Bobo doll. 3 sets of children each observed a different concluding moment from the video. The children in the control group watched nothing but the model hitting the Bobo doll, while another group saw the model receiving a reward for their conduct, and the last group saw the model being punished and cautioned not to act aggressively toward the Bobo doll. As a result, each of these 3 sets of youngsters was relocated to their own room, which contained toys and a Bobo doll. Bandura then discovered that youngsters who witnessed the model receiving a reprimand were less likely to be hostile toward the doll. A second observation is particularly interesting. When researchers encouraged the youngsters to act aggressively against the Bobo doll, as seen in the film they did. This may not seem relevant at first, but it raises an intriguing issue about learned behaviors. So by seeing the model and observing the activities, the youngsters learned the behavior. Learning, often known as recalling the model's behaviors, happened because the children were present to witness them. Now the consequences simply influence whether or not the children choose to practice the learned actions. The memory of the hostility remained, regardless of whether the youngster witnessed the aggression being rewarded or punished. This is also significant. It suggests that just being in a negative situation helped you learn. However, the implications of your surroundings influence how you decide when you face a similar circumstance in the future. There's one additional aspect of the 1963 study worth highlighting. While some of the children in the trial watched a movie, others observed a live model. Now, did this make a significant difference in whether or not the youngsters learned and demonstrated aggressive behaviors? Not really. The Bobo doll experiment has come up again and again as psychologists and researchers debate the concept and impact of violent media. When children play or watch violent video games, are they more prone to perpetrate violence? Or, as in the Bobo doll experiment, do the children just learn the behaviors but retain agency over whether or not they perform them? This conversation is still an important element of psychology today. Who knows? It might not have been if Albert Bandura hadn't established observational learning and social learning theory. As I conclude this video, the Bobo doll experiments remain one of the most important experiments in the field of psychology. I hope you learned a lot about the Bobo doll experiment today. Allow me to ask you a question. Let's say you work in a manufacturing. Do you think extra light in the factory would make you more productive? What about less light throughout the factory? Do you believe you'd be more productive if you worked more hours a day or fewer hours? How about longer or shorter breaks? How do you believe this will affect your efficiency? These are some of the questions researchers posed to themselves in the 1920s. They undertook a study to determine whether or not workers in an electric workplace would be more productive under specific conditions, and the results were unexpected. No matter how they changed the working circumstances, the employees were always more productive. This phenomenon became known as the Hawthorne effect, after the Hawthorne Works electric factory where the research was carried out. This video discusses the Hawthorne effect, its history, and examples of its application in everyday life, including how you might utilize it to improve your own efficiency. Hey everyone, it's Knowle, your gateway to understanding human behavior and emotions. Join us for fascinating insights. Hit subscribe for a part of our journey through the exciting field of psychology. So, what is the Hawthorne effect? The Hawthorne effect, also known as the observer expectancy effect, holds that when people are aware that they are being observed, they change or adjust their behavior. Observation may be a separate variable that researchers must consider while designing or carrying out a study. This becomes an issue when conducting experiments since it might be difficult to present a test without making participants feel as if they are being observed. And the Hawthorne effect affects more than simply the individuals. Researchers believe that the Hawthorne effect may cause the researchers to bias the data or interpret them erroneously. So why is this happening? The responses may vary depending on the study setting. Take productivity studies as an example. As part of the Hawthorne investigations, the workers may have received feedback on their productivity. That extra observation and feedback could contribute to higher productivity. For example, I know I work more harder when I am aware that I am being observed. Another cause is the demand impact. the participants may have wished to satisfy the experimenters by producing the outcomes they expected. This entails working harder even when variables such as working hours or lighting have altered in ways that could contradict the original theory. Another answer could be found in the individual's initial reasons for participating in the study. Throughout the Hawthorne investigations, participants began to question the researchers' objectives. They were concerned that the study might lead to layoffs, which could have a negative impact on motivation. One final cause of the Hawthorne effect is a study involving people and a horse. If the experimenters or viewers are aware of the study's desired outcome, they may unintentionally distort the findings. So in the early 1900s, William von Holsten claimed that his horse, Clever Hans, could solve arithmetic problems. A German psychologist was astounded by this and proceeded to investigate the horse to check if the owner was a scam. And while fraud was not involved, the psychologist did see something odd. If the owner was present or knew the answers to the arithmetic problems, the horse responded correctly 89% of the time. However, if the owner was not present or did not know the answer, the horse only responded correctly 6% of the time. Further research on the Clever Hans effect demonstrates that drug-sniffing dogs and humans are more likely to generate a certain result if the experimenters, owners, or observers in the room are aware of the desired outcome. Many replication experiments have been conducted to prove or disprove the occurrence of the Hawthorne effect, but not all of them have verified its reality, particularly to the extent indicated in the original Hawthorne research. However, other studies support the Hawthorne effect and how it may affect the outcomes of various research projects. For example, number 1 is a study from the American College of Rheumatology that found that the Hawthorne effect may have influenced the rheumatoid arthritis study's outcomes. Researchers assessed the individual's symptoms before, during, and after the trial, and regardless of whether variables were included in the study, the patient's conditions improved. After the trial ended, the conditions deteriorated. This demonstrates that, while the Hawthorne effect has been used in productivity and human behavior studies, it can also have an impact on medical research results. The second example is patients with cerebral palsy. So contradictory evidence can demonstrate the Hawthorne effect in action. In the 1970s, a study was conducted to determine whether a treatment may lessen motor dysfunction in cerebral palsy patients. The researchers collected patient testimony on the treatment's outcome as well as quantitative data from several tests administered to them. It came out that the qualitative and quantitative statistics contradicted each other. The patient claimed that the treatment worked for them, but the results indicated otherwise. This could lend credence to the notion that incentives, the demand effect, and something known as the compliance bias all have an impact on study results. Finally, consider the case of clinical studies. So when patients are selected for a clinical study, they may be banned from leaving the hospital or research institution where the test is being conducted. Some studies believe that the trial effect, as well as the Hawthorne effect, occur here. In addition to the changes and behaviors generated by observers, subjects may be influenced by the degree of care provided in the facility. Furthermore, they may be more inclined to follow the researcher's instructions, which may influence the results. For example, if you're investigating if orange juice lowers cortisol levels, it could be the luxurious therapeutic resort itself, not the orange juice, if you think of it as a holiday. So in order to further investigate human behavior, researchers frequently require human trials. Now, the Hawthorne effect serves as a reminder that humans are difficult to work with and assess. How can researchers keep individuals from providing the responses they wish to hear? Or how could they design a study to best mimic a typical environment, including housing and working conditions? How can all of this be done ethically? These are crucial questions, and the solution isn't yet clear. However, the more you learn about psychology and study design, the easier it will be to challenge conclusions and seek the truth. Thank you very much for viewing this video. I hope you learned more about the Hawthorne effect. If you witnessed a murder, would you intervene? Would you call the police or try to intervene? These are the questions that have arisen in the wake of the Kitty Genovese case. The tale is reminiscent of a roller coaster. It is about power dynamics, media sensationalism, and the real implementation of the 911 system. It is most known for its connection to the bystander effect, also known as Genovese syndrome. The bystander effect has led psychologists to examine how and when people decide to engage in conflict. But before we get into the bystander effect, this video will discuss the Kitty Genovese case. Hey everyone, it's Knowle, your gateway to understanding human behavior and emotions. Join us for fascinating insights. Hit subscribe for a part of our journey through the exciting field of psychology. So what happened to Kitty Genovese? On March 13, 1964, at 3 a.m., Kitty Genovese walked home to her Queens apartment. On her way, she was met by William Moseley, who had been following her home. Moseley pursued Kitty, eventually caught up with her, and stabbed her several times. She screamed for aid, and a neighbor told Moseley to leave Kitty alone. Moseley hurriedly fled the scene, while Kitty dashed to her apartment building. However, Moseley returned after a few minutes. He discovered Kitty laying in front of a door at the back of the apartment building. He stabbed her several times, stole some cash, and fled again. She was stabbed over a dozen times in total, and the incident lasted 30 minutes, during which time many police calls were sent. Kitty died at 4:15 a.m. while being transported to the hospital a few days after the murder. Genovese's death received little attention. It took the police a week to locate the murderer. In fact, they initially identified Kitty's girlfriend as a suspect. So 60 years later, why is this case still one of the most renowned homicides in America? So this gets us to the New York Times piece. The New York Times staff learned about Kitty's murder. However, editor Abe Rosenthal was not very interested in the murder itself. It was the witnesses to the murder. Police had interrogated 38 people as part of their investigations. 5 of them gave testimony during the trial. 2 weeks after Kitty's death, the New York Times ran an item headed 37 who saw murder but didn't call police. The piece went viral across the nation. The media labeled it a failure, painting New York in a negative light. People perceived it as a failing of humanity, and many described it as an example of urban apathy. That same year, editor Abe Rosenthal produced a book titled 38 Witnesses. He challenged us all to think about how we respond to crime and how the urban environment influences our judgments. These questions continue to bother many psychologists and academics today, and entire courses have been built around this case. The search for answers has influenced many people's perspectives on decision-making and how they live their lives. But let's return to the New York Times article for a minute. According to the first line of the story, for more than half an hour, 38 respectable, law-abiding citizens in Queens watched a killer stalk and stab a woman in 3 separate attacks in Kew Gardens. It later states, not one person telephoned the police during the assault. A witness called after the woman had died. Wait a second. You might be wondering, didn't you claim someone actually contacted the cops? Yes. In the 50 or more years since the New York Times published this article, it has received a lot of criticism. New information regarding the case has been discovered, including the fact that Kitty died in the arms of a friend, that many calls were made to the police prior to her death, and that certain witness testimony were deleted because the police had previously received the call. Certainly, 38 individuals did not witness Kitty's death. Many of the 38 people interviewed by police reported hearing screaming, looking out their window, seeing nothing, and returning to bed. The New York Times has gone back to evaluate and update information that was previously disclosed in the inaccurate article. If you want to understand more about determining the facts in this case, I recommend watching The Witness. This documentary follows Kitty's brother, Bill Genovese, as he seeks answers about her life and death. He speaks with reporters involved in the case, witnesses who were surprised to hear they were one of the 38, and other parties involved. It was nominated for a News and Documentary Emmy in 2018, so the New York Times account was not totally true. However, the impact of the Kitty Genovese case and the subsequent stories are accurate. Sociologists, psychologists, and journalists have spent the last 50 years studying the bystander effect and another phenomenon known as the diffusion of blame, both of which occur when people fail to act because there are too many spectators. These phenomena aim to explain, I thought you were going to do something about it, and I didn't want to get involved. The case is also one of the reasons why the 911 system was implemented before to Kitty's death. You might just phone the operator and ask to be connected to the local police station. You could also phone the station's number directly. 3 years later, federal agencies implemented a strategy to build the 911 system that we know today. The first 911 call was placed in 1968. Now, there are numerous storylines within this one instance. There's a story of a witness who failed to call the police. There's a story of a fraudulently reported article that became sensationalized by the media. And there's a narrative about how we as people react to the concept of the bystander effect and the dispersal of culpability. Anyone who has completed high school or college knows that group projects are the worst. It always appears that no one is doing their part, and someone must stand up and take on the majority of the responsibility. Why does this happen, though? Psychologists may attribute it to the bystander effect, although this phenomenon is not limited to the college classroom. It occurs in cities, crowds, and even murder scenes. Hey everyone, it's Knowle, your gateway to understanding human behavior and emotions. Join us for fascinating insights. Hit subscribe for a part of our journey through the exciting field of psychology. First, what is the bystander effect? The bystander effect states that if you are surrounded by others, you are less inclined to intervene or take action. People are simply less likely to aid another person if they believe they are in the presence of a throng. So since the 1960s, researchers have been studying the bystander effect. Many psychologists believe that research into the bystander effect began with the murder of Kitty Genovese. If you don't already know or haven't watched my film, Genovese was murdered outside her apartment at 3 a.m. in 1964. 2 weeks later, the New York Times ran an item called 37 Who Saw Murder Didn't Call the Police. This headline shook the globe because how could 37 people fail to respond when something so awful occurred? Does this imply that cities such as New York were particularly dangerous? Do people not feel compassion? These are some of the questions that psychologists have sought to solve since the 1960s. So, how can individuals explain their inaction in the instance of Kitty Genovese? According to media reports, spectators just did not want to get involved. However, social psychologists have a more scientific explanation for why the bystander effect exists. Attribution is the study of how humans explain causes and consequences. Bystander apathy is frequently explained using a type of attribution known as the diffusion of culpability. When we're in a large group, the responsibility for taking action is distributed throughout the entire group. This lessens each individual's duty and motivation to help. For example, if you are the lone witness to a robbery, you are responsible for stopping the act or reporting it to the authorities. However, if you are in a crowd and witness a robbery, you are one of several people who can potentially intervene and report the crime to the authorities. When the same responsibility is distributed to a bigger group of people, everyone is more likely to say, someone else will do it. See, we believe that each person may psychologically allocate responsibility to someone in the crowd who appears more capable, or that they should take action. 4 years after Kitty Genovese's murder, 2 social psychologists conducted several studies on the bystander effect. John M. Darley and Bib Latane created various scenarios in which people would see or hear a potential disaster. Subjects could be alone, in a small group, or in a big group. The researchers would next note whether or not the participant had reported the occurrence. So consider their first experiment. The researchers gave the respondents a questionnaire to complete in a room. They then left the room and began filling it with smoke. In one room, the patient was completely alone. 3 persons sat in another room, and 3 more sat in the last room, with 2 of them noticing the smoke but ignoring it. So here are the results. 75% of the individuals who sat alone in the room stood up and reported the incident to someone in the building. Only 38% of participants who sat in the room with 3 other people reported it, and even more shockingly, 10% of those who were in the room with persons who acknowledged the smoke eventually reported. So the issue here is that as more people enter the room, the likelihood of someone reporting the smoke, which is a problem, decreases. It has been more than 50 years since Kitty Genovese's murder, and you should be aware that the New York Times headline that startled the world has subsequently been exposed as a hoax. Because while 38 people told the police they heard something, there were not 37 eyewitnesses to her murder, and the police received more than one report concerning the screaming. However, its research on the bystander effect remains an unsettling look at how we spread culpability and justify our inaction. Cases of the bystander effect continue to dominate headlines throughout the world. For example, in September 2019, Cassie Morris, a 16-year-old, was stabbed to death while fighting outside a strip mall. Dozens of people watched the teen's death, with several filming the brawl and broadcasting it on Snapchat, but no one intervened. In reality, 8 people are currently in jail. People's failure to intervene during an emergency may be attributed to brain development, societal standards, and other reasons. There is still a lot of research to be done on the bystander effect, and attribution might vary from instance to case. But we do know that stories like Kitty Genovese and Cassie Morris shock and frequently discuss the world. Failure to act portrays a picture of a world in which people are innately cruel and endure misery. And most people don't want to live in such a world. So what can you do? Well, understanding the diffusion of responsibility, or the bystander effect, may help you make better decisions when you observe an incident or, more simply, when working on a cooperative project. If you find yourself claiming you don't want to get involved or standing about waiting for someone else to take action, remember you are a bystander. You should take action if you witness wrongdoing. You should report items before waiting for someone else to do so. You may be able to rescue someone's college grade or life. What do amusement parks, horror movies, and rock climbing walls have in common? They all get your pulse rate up, give you a surge of adrenaline at some point, and are excellent first dates. These 3 commonalities are not unconnected. These 3 date ideas are popular because they get both you and your date's heart racing. In fact, some people sweat out of anticipation or dread, and by the conclusion of the date, you may find yourself staring at the other person with butterflies in your stomach. However, these butterflies are not always caused by your attraction to the other person, even if you continue to believe that you had a fantastic date. This is known as misattribution arousal, and it's rather fascinating. It's one of the many ways our brains might get confused and misinterpret how we're feeling. So, what is misattribution? There are numerous ways in which our brains misattribute information. So, misattribute simply means to commit an error. Social psychologists have investigated a number of various misattributions that alter how we perceive the world and recall events. The misattribution of arousal is especially intriguing since it relates utterly arbitrary behaviors like as running or watching a scary movie to how beautiful someone else appears to us. So in the misattribution of arousal, arousal does not always imply sexual arousal. To arouse simply means to awaken or elicit a specific feeling. It could relate to the activation of our fight or flight reaction, or the awakening of someone from sleep. So think about your body's reaction whether you're in love, feeling in love, or going on an exciting first date. Your heart races, your palms sweat profusely, and you probably feel a little apprehensive. Consider how your body reacts to a thrilling movie or as you approach the top of a roller coaster. They are the same reactions, correct? Consider us humans. We are creatures who create meaning. Our brains seek a reason for how we feel, and on a date, we may misinterpret our sweaty palms and racing heart for sexual excitement when we are actually nervous about rock climbing or attending a horror movie. As I proceed, I'd like to tell you more about this bridge experiment. In 1974, psychologists Donald Dutton and Arthur Aaron put this notion to test. They designed an experiment in which male participants walked over 2 bridges. One bridge was strong and low to the ground, while the other was suspended high in the air, making it less sturdy and intended to elicit a panic response. The researchers expected that the participants could misinterpret their arousal from the terrifying bridge and believe they were more attracted to a woman they met during the experiment. So they asked the woman to meet the participants at 2 distinct points during the exam. The initial meeting occurred in the center of the bridge. The woman administered a thematic apperception exam to the males, which involved showing them an image and asking them to tell them a story about it. The image was not intended to inspire sexual undertones in the text. It was simply a normal image. Now, the men who were on the suspension bridge high in the air were far more likely to incorporate sexual aspects into the story than the men who were not on the bridge. However, the experiment was not over. The woman also met the men at the bridge's end, or perhaps not far from it. The idea here is that the men would have cooled down after the exhilaration of the suspension bridge. It is also worth noting that the woman had no idea what the hypothesis was for the experiment. So she was told to give each of the men her phone number and inform them that if they had any questions, they could call her. I believe you can see where this is going. The same experiment was conducted with a male at the end of a bridge, and there was no difference in whether the supposedly straight individuals contacted the male after the experiment was completed. However, there was a difference when the researchers chose a woman for the trial. The guys who met the woman right after exiting the suspension bridge were far more likely to call her than the man. This confirmed the researchers' hypothesis. There are a few more trials, but keep in mind that it also works the opposite way around. A few other tests attempted to duplicate the bridge experiment's findings in 1974, with one in particular expanding on the concept of how misattribution influences attraction. In 1981, researchers released Passionate Love and the Misattribution of Arousal. It is quite a study name. Anyway, the publication included 2 separate studies in which males were asked to watch a video of a lady talking about herself and score her beauty. The videos were shot in a way that made the woman appear more or less appealing. In order to induce arousal, some men were subjected to exercise tests prior to seeing the movie. The researchers discovered that aroused men were not only more likely to perceive attractive women as attractive than the control group, but also more likely to rank unattractive women as less appealing. There have also been research on the misattribution of arousal in women. One study in particular found that different types of arousal can influence both men and women. For example, in 2017, researchers released Misattribution of Musical Arousal Increases Sexual Attraction Towards Opposite Sex Spaces in Females, and the results were quite self-explanatory. When women were aroused by music, they were more likely to find neutral male faces attractive than when they judged the faces in quiet. So how does this affect you and your dates? Because you may have been thinking throughout the film, I know what I'm going to do for my next date, something scary. However, the actual takeaway from this film should be the significance of knowing yourself and your body. You may believe that the butterflies in your stomach were caused by the girl you went on a date with or the food in front of you, but that attractiveness could simply be due to other feelings in your body. How about the rest of your environment? The greater your self-awareness of what is going on in your body, the less likely you are to misinterpret arousal and desire. The Stanford prison experiment made its theatrical debut in 2015. The film documented the infamous 1971 experiment in which 24 college students were imprisoned. The experiment was meant to run 2 weeks, but it was cut short after 6 days due to the psychological effects it was having on both the guards and the convicts. So what exactly happened during the Stanford prison experiment? Why is it so infamous? And does the film get everything correct? Or is it simply a dramatization? This video will provide a quick overview of the experiment, its impact on the field of psychology, and the criticism that it will face 45 years later. Hey everyone, it's Knowle, your gateway to understanding human behavior and emotions. Join us for fascinating insights. Hit subscribe for a part of our journey through the exciting field of psychology. So what is the Stanford prison experiment? Milgram's experiment shocked the field of psychology, leaving many individuals with doubts about compliance, power dynamics, and power abuse. Philip Zimbardo, a Stanford professor, wants to investigate these topics further. With a Navy grant, Zimbardo established the Stanford Prison Experiment. He wanted to investigate if a person's role influenced their behavior. Zimbardo and his team interviewed 70 Stanford hopefuls who agreed to participate in the 14-day study for $15 per day. They wanted to ensure that they selected the smartest and most mentally sound people. After narrowing down the applications to 24, the researchers tossed a coin to distribute the roles. Half of the participants would be inmates, while the other half would be guards. The researchers then put up a basement at Stanford to resemble a real prison. They were serious about approaching the experiment as a simulation. Prisoners were arrested in public and transported to prison. They were even booked, fingerprinted, and strip-searched. Zimbardo's team also assigned convicts numbers that were to be used instead of their true names. They believed that it would provide the prisoners a sense of anonymity and benefit the experiment. Guards had almost complete freedom in how they treated the detainees, with the exception of two major rules. They could not punch the prisoners, and they could not keep them in solitary confinement for more than an hour. Philip Zimbardo played the jail superintendent. His graduate students and research partners served on the parole board and as prison wardens. Prisoners were assigned specific tasks, such as sending a letter home to their visitors and presenting a case to the parole board for release. Guards also put the inmates to counts that required them to perform jumping jacks, push-ups, and other unpleasant chores. It didn't take long before these guards began to misuse their authority. Within one day, a guard struck one of the convicts with his nightstick. On the second day, the prisoners attempted to mutiny, so their beds were removed. To punish the convicts, the guard fired a fire extinguisher into their cell. Guards utilized physical and psychological abuse, including as sleep deprivation, to punish and intimidate captives. Throughout the study, the prisoners were required to wear bandages and stocking caps at all times, and the guards would occasionally place bags over their heads. Since the study's conclusion, it has been compared to acts at the Abu Ghraib Detention Center. Zimbardo has written about the case and its similarities to the jail experiment since. So, why was this experiment shut down? The guards rapidly began to abuse their power, and the convicts spiraled out of control. On the third day, prisoner number 8612 began crying and screaming hysterically. He threatened to kill himself and contact a lawyer. To avoid any psychological harm or a lawsuit, he was released. Two other convicts were released during the next 2 days, one of whom refused to eat. On the fifth day, Zimbardo's girlfriend, a former student, arrived to see the experiment. Zimbardo and his colleagues had been watching and participating in the experiment around the clock. When she saw the horrors going on in the prison, she begged Zimbardo to stop the experiment immediately. She even threatened to break up with him. On the sixth day, he concluded the experiment. This experiment demonstrated how rapidly people may abuse authority when given it, yet it remains one of the most contentious experiments in the field of psychology. There are several reasons why. The first one is obvious: the psychological abuse that the convicts suffered during the study. Is it ethical to subject human participants to such agony and trauma that many were unable to complete the experiment? Now, Zimbardo says that none of the subjects experienced long-term psychological repercussions, but the point remains. In recent years, critics have come up to claim that the results were not as natural as Zimbardo and his team may have led you to believe. Transcripts and audio recordings from the Stanford prison experiment reveal that Zimbardo's staff taught these guards, telling them to be tough for the sake of the experiment. Even the prisoners could have been fabricating their reactions. Prisoner number 8612, most remembered for his chilling comment, "I'm burning up inside," has come forward to claim that his stint in the Stanford County Jail was more of an improvisational exercise. Many reviewers have described the experiment as a play rather than a serious psychology experiment. Carlo Prescott, the experiment's jail consultant, has also come forward to claim that the most severe punishments were not organically devised and carried out by the guards alone. He wrote the following in an op-ed. Ideas such as bags being placed over prisoners' heads, inmates being bound together with chains, and buckets being used in place of toilets in their cells were all experiences of mine at the old Spanish jail section of San Quentin, which I dutifully shared with the Stanford Prison Experiment Brain Trust months before the experiment began. To claim that all of these properly tested, mentally sound upper-middle-class Caucasian guards came up with this on their own is ridiculous. So you may take that as you will. Let us now discuss the Stanford Prison Experiment's long-term impact. It seemed to have generated more questions than answers. Where should psychologists draw the line when it comes to causing volunteers grief for scientific purposes? And how easily do psychologists blur the distinction between an experiment, a simulation, and a drama? And if the Stanford Prison Experiment does not fully address its initial questions about power dynamics and obedience, what other experiments can? These are only a few of the questions that psychologists are asking today concerning the experiment. Would you give a person a fatal electric shock? Would you follow orders just to conduct a violent crime against an innocent person if someone instructed you to, or would you support an unjust cause simply because someone told you to? People rarely consider themselves violent or capable of doing violent acts. They rarely imagine themselves on the wrong side of history. Nonetheless, human history is filled with bloodshed, genocides, and massacres. In fact, in today's environment, you may encounter friends and relatives who you assume are nice, embracing violence. But how can this occur? So I'm going to tell you about a psychological experiment that aims to explain why people commit acts of aggression against others. And then I'll ask you these questions again. The actual answers to these questions may surprise you. Hey everyone, it's Knowle, your gateway to understanding human behavior and emotions. Join us for fascinating insights. Hit subscribe for a part of our journey through the exciting field of psychology. As a result, this study is referred to as the Milgram shock study, or the Milgram experiment. It is named after Stanley Milgram, the psychologist who conducted the study. Milgram was born in 1930s New York City to Jewish immigrant parents. He grew up witnessing the Holocaust atrocities from thousands of miles distant. How could humans perpetrate such atrocities? How could individuals see the atrocity in front of them and still engage in it? These questions followed him as he trained as a psychologist at Yale University. And in 1961, he decided to conduct a research to demonstrate how people obey authority even when it contradicts their morals. So how did the study proceed? Over a 2-year period, Milgram recruited men to engage in a study. He devised a few modifications of the study, but in general, each had a participant, a learner, and an experimenter. The participant behaved as a teacher, reading aloud to the learner. The student would then need to repeat the words back to the participant. And if the student's words were incorrect, the teacher had to administer an electric shock. These shocks have now increased in voltage. Initially, the shocks were roughly 15 volts, producing a slight feeling. However, the shocks got as high as 450 volts, which is exceedingly deadly. Now, you should know that these shocks were not real. The learner participated in the study as an actor, thus no one was hurt. The experimenter encouraged the participants to deliver these shocks whenever the learner was incorrect. As the voltage rose, several participants resisted. In other iterations of the study, the investigator would encourage subjects to deliver the shocks. This occurred in stages. Some individuals were asked to continue, and they eventually had no choice but to do so. In other iterations of the study, the actor would urge the participant not to deliver the shocks, citing a cardiac condition. In other situations, the actor even pretended to die after the greatest voltages were achieved. So you might be astonished to learn that this study took place. There are certainly some ethical problems about encouraging individuals to administer severe electrical and even fatal shocks. The trauma of that study may have an influence on the participants, some of whom did not realize the truth about the study for months after it ended. Maybe they believed they had killed someone. However, you may be startled to learn that many volunteers actually administered the most deadly shocks. After the experiment, Milgram asked a group of his students how many individuals they expected to provide the most shock, and the students predicted 3%. However, in the most well-known variation of the study, a staggering 65% of individuals received the greatest level of shocks, with every single participant reaching 300-volt levels. So, the Milgram shock study took place over 50 years ago, and it remains one of the most contentious and infamous experiments in contemporary history. The study also served as inspiration for television movies. However, not everyone applauds Milgram for his audacity. The study's findings are not particularly encouraging, and psychologists have criticized it throughout the years. After all, Milgram's selection of subjects was not flawless. All of the participants were male, which accounts for only 50% of the population. Would the results alter if women were asked to administer the electric shocks? Another issue to consider is that, as with the Stanford prison experiment, all of the volunteers responded to a newspaper ad offering to participate in the study for money. Would the outcomes have differed if the subjects had not volunteered for an unknown study? Other critics argued that the documentation of Milgram's studies indicates that some volunteers were compelled into taking part in the study. Gina Perry, a psychologist, believes that individuals were even bullied into completing the survey. Perry also believes Milgram failed to inform the subjects about the truth of the study. Rather than informing participants that a learner was an actor and that shocks were never delivered, experimenters simply allowed individuals to relax after the research before sending them home. She believes that many people were never told the truth, which is unethical, especially given that their participation could have resulted in harm to another individual. Moving on, let's talk briefly about replications. Because the majority of these research were conducted 50 years ago, psychologists attempted to retest Milgram's hypotheses, but it was difficult to reproduce the study due to the contentious methodologies. However, similar research have slightly modified Milgram's techniques and produced similar results. Other replications expand on Milgram's findings, demonstrating that people are more obedient than they appear. Now, does this imply that we're all evil individuals hiding behind a veneer of sound judgment? Not really. 5 years after Milgram's experiment, a psychologist named Walter Mitchell wrote Personality and Assessment. It suggested that attribute theorists were looking at personality theory incorrectly. He proposed that different contexts could lead to diverse behaviors, giving rise to the concept of situationism. Situationism is still supported by studies such as Milgram's experiment and the Stanford prison experiment. So let me ask you these questions at the beginning of the video. Would you give a person a fatal electric shock? Would you carry out orders to conduct a violent crime against an innocent person? Would you embrace an unjust cause simply because someone told you to? Or does it simply depend on the situation? Consider this scenario. You're walking down the street at night when a person dressed as a clown appears out of nowhere and begins sprinting towards you. Obviously, you'll have an emotional response. But what is it? Perhaps we say, I am afraid. Maybe you say, I'll start running. Or you may add, I completely freeze up and start sweating. You see, our emotions are complex. We feel those feelings not just in our heads, but also in our bodies. Emotions can drive intentional or involuntary activities, and psychologists have spent many years attempting to understand how our minds and bodies perceive various emotions. There have been numerous hypotheses proposed to explain the function of arousal, cognition, and behavior. However, all have since been disproven and replaced by newer theories. The James Lange hypothesis of human emotion was the first in modern psychology, and it focused on the body's physical arousal. It was later supplanted by the Cannon-Bard theory, which proposed that emotions originated in the intellect rather than the body. These hypotheses did not satisfy many cognitive psychologists, including Stanley Schachter and Jerome Singer. This prompted the development of the Schachter-Singer theory of emotion, generally known as the two-factor theory of emotion. So let's look at what these two distinct components are, how they interact, and how this theory fits into cognitive and social psychology. So first and foremost, what is the two-factor theory of emotion? The two-factor theory of emotion acknowledges that cognition and arousal both contribute to emotional identity and feelings. Emotion is not solely the result of bodily sensations or mental thinking. Both of these processes influence the feelings we experience and express to others. Context, previous experiences, and an individual's understanding of their own body can all influence how they identify or experience emotions. So let's dive into the two components. Schachter and Singer argued that humans felt emotions when they were aroused and had context or cues to assist them identify and categorize these emotions. The process began with arousal. So the first one is bodily. Arousal is defined in psychology as a state of alertness to the point of perception, and while it plays a role in sexual sensations, it is also vital in fight or flight consciousness, as well as just paying attention. When a person experiences stimuli that elicit specific emotions, they initially feel physiological arousal. This arousal occurs in the sympathetic nervous system. Maybe your palms sweat, your chest tightens, or your hands and feet go numb. The second aspect is mental. When a person sees this arousal, they must use external indicators to figure out what is going on. This prompts them to identify their emotions. Appraisal is a cognitive process. When confronted with a potentially dangerous stimuli, humans engage in one or more rounds of assessment. First, a person will undergo primary appraisal. Their thinking wonders, is this stimulus a threat? In the example I gave at the start of this video, you'd probably conclude that a bizarre clown running at you is a threat. Secondary appraisal is the next step. The body then asks the mind, how do I handle this threat? Frequently, the answer is either fight, flight, or freeze. You may find yourself hitting the clown, fleeing, or freezing in dread. However, cognition does not cease here. If you learn new knowledge that alters your perception of the issue, you may need to reappraise it. For example, perhaps the clown calls out your name. You can then recognize your best friend's voice. Now this idiot does not appear to be such a menace. It's just your pal pulling a prank on you. Your palms may be sweaty and your pulse may still be racing, but you now recognize your experience as relief rather than dread. Schachter and Singer then conducted an experiment to test their beliefs regarding these processes. Participants were injected with epinephrine. It's a hormone that causes a rise in heart rate and a few other negative effects, but these individuals were aware of what to expect. However, not all of them did. The subjects were then placed in a room with a confederate, who acted either euphorically or furiously toward them. Participants who were aware of the side effects reported no significant changes in their moods, whereas those who were unaware of the side effects were far more likely to report mood changes. So individuals in the room with the euphoric confederate were more likely to name their emotions as euphoria, whereas those in the room with the furious confederate were more likely to label their emotions as anger. This demonstrated that both physical arousal and contextual cues influence a person's ability to perceive and identify emotions. So this theory assumes that people are aware of their emotions and that when they experience those emotions, a bodily response occurs within their bodies. When you first have a panic attack, for example, you may be unable to pinpoint what is going on inside your body. These new feelings, such as your chest constricting or your hands tingling, may seem perplexing to you, but they are still occurring regardless of whether you can recognize them. A study of guys on a bridge aimed to invalidate the two-factor theory of emotion. The participants were encouraged to go across two separate bridges, one narrower and scarier than the other, and at the conclusion of each bridge, a woman handed the men a questionnaire and instructed them to phone her with any questions or comments. Interestingly, the researchers discovered that men who walked across the terrifying bridge were considerably more inclined to call the woman and tell her stories with sexual content. So you may be wondering why they did this. The researchers believe that when the men walked across the terrifying bridge, their bodies reacted in some way, and then the men used cognitive processes to infer that their arousal was caused by their sexual attraction to the woman rather than the bridge. This is known as the misattribution of arousal. So one could argue that the guys identified their emotions inaccurately, but only because their physiological arousal and cognitive interpretations occurred in distinct processes. This study appears to provide evidence for the two-factor theory of emotion. Finally, because the two-factor theory of emotion is relatively new in the field of psychology, I want to address some criticisms of it. It was initially launched in 1962, and not all replications of Schachter and Singer's original experiments have yielded identical results. While there may be more to explain about the mental and physical processes involved in distinguishing emotions, Schachter and Singer's approach brings us closer than some of the previous simpler theories. Suppose you're looking at a marshmallow. You have two options. Wait for the first marshmallow and then get a second marshmallow, or eat one marshmallow now and be done. How long do you think you'd wait for the second marshmallow? Would you wait for the second marshmallow at all? This was the challenge confronting preschool-age children in the 1960s. They had no idea that the way they solved this challenge would become part of one of history's most famous psychological studies. In this video, I'll explain the Stanford marshmallow test, what it was, what it stated about success, and how it continues to influence psychology today. So the idea of this test was quite simple. Stanford professor Walter Mitchell and his team placed a single marshmallow in front of a child, generally aged 4 or 5. They told the child that they'd leave the room and return in a few minutes. If the child ate the marshmallow, they would not be able to acquire another. But if the child waited until the researcher returned to the room, they could get another marshmallow. Researchers noted which children ate the marshmallow and which waited, and then the researchers waited. They waited and waited. When the children were teenagers, the researchers revisited them and asked their parents a series of questions on their cognitive abilities, stress management, and ability to maintain self-control under pressure. They also looked at the students' SAE and AT scores. A few years later, the researchers evaluated the participants again for self-control. So what exactly did they find? In summary, Mitchell and his team discovered that establishing self-control as a toddler had a significant impact on the child's subsequent success in life. Success took many forms. According to their parents, children who waited for the second marshmallow scored higher on the SAT, had lower levels of substance misuse, were less likely to be obese, and had greater social skills and self-control overall. To my astonishment, one of the children who passed the marshmallow test was Susan Wojcicki, YouTube's CEO. In her book, How to Raise Successful People, Susan's mother mentioned that one of the researchers contacted her and informed her that Susan was the child who had waited the longest. Because of the nature of the experiment, the findings were published in the 1980s and 1990s. Since then, the field of psychology has regarded this study as one of the most important, paving the way for new perspectives on how personality influences and predicts success. But first, let's discuss why the children ate the marshmallow immediately away. The marshmallow test, however, was able to provide researchers with evidence linking self-control to success. In summary, your ability to regulate yourself as a child may have an impact on your adult achievement. But what factors influenced self-control? Because not all children took the marshmallow right away. Mitchell and his team devised a hot and cool style of thinking to explain why youngsters would have eaten the marshmallow right away. The same style of thinking might be applied to any task that requires immediate pleasure, such as making a purchase or smoking a cigarette. Okay, here we go. When we're not tempted, most individuals hang out on the cool system. It is the cognitive ability to consider the long-term rewards. We all know that smoking is terrible for us, and refusing a cigarette will benefit our long-term health. We know that if we wait, we'll get more marshmallows, and that if we go to the gym instead of pushing the snooze button, we'll be more alert later and healthier in the end. On the opposite side are heated stimuli. They pose a threat to the cooling system. When things warm up and grow hot, our behavior becomes more impulsive. We smoke the cigarette, consume the marshmallow, and press the snooze button. But this raises the question of why some people heat up faster than others. Why are certain stimuli hotter than others? These are the questions that psychologists like Mitchell have been attempting to address. There are several other studies in this field. The Stanford marshmallow test collected data from a small and not particularly varied set of individuals. Not all of the researchers believed that the test had discovered the one genuine key to success. So a more recent study was conducted to retake the marshmallow test, focusing on many social and economic issues that may also influence a child's performance. The mother's educational background was the most important element they considered. They divided the participants into groups based on whether or not their mother had a college degree. The researchers additionally adjusted for family background, early cognitive abilities, and the child's home environment. In short, they discovered that self-control did not have the same effect on success as the Marshmallow experiment predicted. Children from more affluent parents were more likely to simply exercise self-control. When the researchers controlled for social and economic factors, they discovered that self-control was not important in predicting success, which raised a lot of warning flags. This not only calls into doubt the results of self-control, but it also raises the question of why children grab marshmallows in the first place. Researchers have expressed varying perspectives, including comments on how scarcity affects a child's ability to use and take resources. Think about it. Wealthy children do not have many problems waiting for food, toys, or other items. Their parents can afford it. They will get it. However, children from low-income homes face additional challenges. Food can be scarce. A parent may promise to take their children to a great restaurant or purchase them an interesting item, but they may not be able to follow through on it. If something is right in front of you, you might as well take it because there's no assurance it'll be there later or that you'll get a reward for waiting. I thought this take on the marshmallow test was interesting. Another few research on willpower and self-discipline have found that removing the temptation from one's control allows people to resist it for longer. For example, if an alcoholic discards any alcohol in the house, a person attempting to lose weight has someone else purchase for them, or a person wishing to study just sells their game console. The concept is that it's difficult to resist temptation, but it's simple if you remove the option. In the Marshmallow experiment films, they discovered that the children who diverted themselves performed the best. They covered their eyes, played a game, or perhaps summed to themselves. This is only a little more information about the theory of willpower, but I'll have another video on it later. Let us get back to the marshmallow test. While recent research has claimed to refute the marshmallow test, the study's impact is undeniably noteworthy. Mitchell's research demonstrated how specific personality qualities affected a child's chances of success. Further research has been conducted on various personality qualities and how they connect to success in areas such as business or romantic relationships. Without the marshmallow test, we might not have heard of phrases like growth mindset or emotional intelligence. The marshmallow test is not the only classic experiment that has recently under criticism. Psychology is currently experiencing what is known as a replication crisis. Replications of world-renowned experiments such as the marshmallow test and the Stanford jail experiment reveal that these tests may not be as reliable or accurate as we were taught in school. Psychology, like any other field involving the scientific method, is constantly evolving, with psychologists continuing to modify, change, and adjust hypotheses that do not stand up to modern tests. However, once we get back on track, self-control does have an effect on behavior and perhaps success. However, it is up to current and future generations to learn more about how self-control is influenced and how it affects other personality traits and variables. We all know someone who is a little delicate. Perhaps they are very skinny and lanky. They do everything they can to avoid tripping, falling, or getting roughed up. It's almost like they're made of glass, but and they all know they aren't. Or do they? This would not be an unusual occurrence. In medieval times, nobility were known to believe they were formed of glass. Science wasn't very advanced back then. People who had the glass delusion were experiencing exactly that, a delusion. This video will go into the history of something called the glass delusion, some of the most notable people who experienced it, and whether or not it existed in medieval times. The glass delusion is one of psychology's greatest riddles, and it's undoubtedly one of the most intriguing delusions in history. So the 16th and 17th centuries were periods of rapid expansion in the Western world. European empires were beginning to grow in North America, and their nobility wielded more influence than ever. During this time, there were significant cultural and artistic developments. The Mona Lisa was painted, the Baroque period began, and innovations with glass altered the way we saw ourselves. According to academics, mirrors were invented about this period. Mirrors are now an integral part of our daily lives, although they were once thought to be more magical than functional. During this time, history reveals that a lot of nobility suffered what we call glass illusion. They believed that their physical bodies were composed of glass. What's remarkable about the glass hallucination is that it was most popular among this particular group of people. Not everyone in medieval times wrapped themselves in blankets and took care not to bump against anything. This misconception was most likely to affect the wealthy and educated. Glass delusion appears in plays and literature from this time period, including a character known as the glass graduate. You should also be aware that not everyone who suffers from the delusion experiences it in the same way. Some thought their entire bodies, from head to toe, were composed of glass. Others claimed that only their internal organs were composed of glass. Many people, including King Charles VI, believed that he had a glass buttocks. People like him wandered around with cushions attached to their buttocks to avoid breaking their behind. King Charles VI was among the most well-known aristocrats who suffered from glass illusion. He became king at the age of 11, and while he was first known as Charles the Beloved, he shortly became Charles the Mad. Starting in his early 20s, King Charles VI suffered from several mental illnesses, including the glass illusion. These incidents included him believing he was Saint George and entirely forgetting that he was the King of France. He didn't always recognize his wife, and he refused to bathe or change his clothes for months on end. Indeed, entire books were written at the time about the various delusions that this king suffered from. And when it came to the glass illusion, King Charles VI was particularly suspicious and cautious. He wrapped himself in blankets so his buttocks wouldn't break. He also had iron rods sewed into his garments to prevent his body from shattering if he collided with another person. Next, we'll proceed to Princess Alexandra Emily. King Charles VI is the most renowned example of someone suffering from glass delusion, but he is not the only monarch who believed they were made of glass. Princess Alexandra Emily was the Bavarian king's daughter in the 1830s. The princess was discovered strolling suspiciously through her home, avoiding contact with any item. When asked what was wrong, the princess explained that as a youngster, she swallowed a whole grand piano made of glass. She assumed the piano was still in her body. She stated that if she touched anything, the piano would shatter. So it wasn't just one case. Why do people believe they were created of glass? Princess Alexandra Emily was one of the last documented cases of glass illusion. Occurrences appeared here and there beginning in the 1500s, but few or no occurrences were reported after the 1840s. At first inspection, this condition appears to be completely random. Why would anyone believe that they were made of glass? And why were only rich people impacted by this delusion? Understanding the medical beliefs of the historical period may provide some insight into how glass delusion evolved into a temporary mental disorder that only affected the noble class from the 16th to the 19th century. At the time, humorism was a medical study that originated in ancient Greece and Rome and continues to influence much of modern medicine. Now, the study was based on what we call the four humors, or biological fluids, which indicated some sort of mood or behavior within the body. The four humors included blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Now, black bile may not be what you think it is. Medical professionals at the time believed that the kidneys and spleen produced black bile. When it was produced, people used to believe that it generated melancholy and unhappiness, and that if your body produced an excess of melancholy, you would eventually feel heavy and sluggish. But there's another feature of black bile that's very relevant to glass delusion. When black bile was heated, experts said it shone like glass. This link is why many modern psychologists assume that glass delusion was a symptom of grief or paranoia. Nobles and royalty were not the only ones to feel sad. So why were they affected? We have to return to humorism for the answer. At the time, experts believed that overstimulating the mind would result in an excess of black bile, and that if a man used his intellect more than his body, he would be more likely to create this bile and become depressed. However, not all psychologists see this link between intellect and glass delusion. Others argue that glass delusion is more about privacy and transparency. According to the authors, the dread of breaking and shattering might be a severe kind of social anxiety. People who suffer from social anxiety may be afraid of falling flat on their faces or stumbling in public. In short, people do not want to be humiliated, and in certain circumstances, this can escalate from a dread of social anxiety to a worry of complete bodily parts shattering. Finally, I'd like to discuss some more recent cases of glass delusion, because other psychologists feel that glass delusion was so prevalent in the 16th and 17th centuries because glass and mirrors were such novel phenomena. Throughout history, humans have linked fear and delusion to advances in technology and culture. So which idea concerning the glass delusion is correct? Well, it's difficult to say, especially since examples of the glass delusion have been reported as late as the 20th century. It's important mentioning that these incidents were isolated. It was not as if all social classes were afflicted as they were in medieval times. But they do continue to lend mystery to the situation. A case emerged in the 1880s, another in the 1930s, and a third in the 1960s. In the most recent occurrence, a psychologist studying the man with the glass hallucination found something remarkable. The man had lately been in an accident and was surrounded by friends and relatives who were desperate to care for and protect him. The man felt overwhelmed, and the psychologist hypothesized that the glass hallucination allowed him to glide in and out of being there. If he had been translucent or see-through, he would not have had to deal with his family's overwhelming presence. So, what is the truth? In the years since the outbreaks of glass delusion, psychologists have learned a great deal about the inner workings of the body and mind. We no longer believe that black bile promotes depression or anxiety. An overworked mind does not necessarily lead to the idea that one is composed of glass. So, what is the reality behind the glass illusion? Well, we don't know for sure. There are numerous unusual, unpredictable, and temporary mental diseases that have affected huge numbers of people. Some of these strange ailments are linked to culture or class, while others follow less of a pattern. These are some of the most fascinating anecdotes in psychology, demonstrating that we still have much to learn about the workings of the mind. It can be tough to understand how beliefs can be so strong if you are suspicious about ideas like the power of positive thinking or the law of attraction from the book, The Secret. How can simply thinking about yourself or others bring about change? And can science actually show this? Yes, psychologists have discovered evidence to support the idea that your views can have a significant impact, even if those beliefs are wrong about something or someone. Some of this evidence comes from the concept of a self-fulfilling prophecy. In this video, I'll discuss what a self-fulfilling prophecy is and how research has shown that even a false fact may be manifested through the power of belief. Self-fulfilling prophecies have impacted people's lives throughout history and have served as the basis for numerous films, plays, and books. So what precisely is it? Robert Burton, a South Philadelphia-born sociologist and psychologist, defined a self-fulfilling prophecy. He coined the term self-fulfilling prophecy while attending Harvard University. He defines a self-fulfilling prophecy as a false definition of a circumstance that elicits new behavior, causing the originally incorrect perception to become true. Many feel Merton's childhood influenced his invention of the self-fulfilling prophecy. He was born to Eastern European immigrants and grew up in the impoverished neighborhood of South Philadelphia. He was also growing up in an era when the American dream offered riches and fortune to immigrants who came to America and worked hard. The concept of a self-fulfilling prophecy is similar to the law of attraction, the power of positive thought, and other fundamental manifestation notions. If you think anything about yourself, you will continue to live that notion regardless of whether it is accurate. However, the self-fulfilling prophecy operates in a cycle, explaining how prejudice, bias, and quick judgments about people can have a greater impact than you might realize. So I'll explain how the cycle works. Because self-fulfilling prophecies operate in a circle, we must first believe in ourselves. Maybe it's that we're truly capable of taking on a specific project at work, or maybe it's that we're powerless, that what we do is meaningless. These ideas then influence our behavior. If you believe you are capable of taking on the world, you may confidently run for municipal council. Others will see your behavior and form their own opinions about you. They witness your confidence and efforts to alter the world, which stem from your values, and they say, "Wow, that person can really take on the world." These individuals subsequently begin to act in ways that mirror their views. For example, they may vote for you, tell your neighbors that you are confident or know what you're doing, or applaud you at a town hall meeting. Then you begin to observe those activities. You see those people clapping for you and sense the support of your community. These incidents support your initial assumptions about yourself, and the cycle begins again. Of course, this cycle can be disrupted or penetrated at any point. Unfortunately, this loop works even when your thoughts are negative. If someone has low expectations for you from the outset, you may begin to meet those assumptions. Self-fulfilling prophecies do not have to begin with your thoughts about yourself. And as you'll see from the studies and my illustrations of this phenomenon, we constantly impose self-fulfilling prophecies on others. When society teaches you that everyone with a given color, gender, religion, or other distinguishing characteristics is a good or evil person, it can be quite tempting to fall into those categories and perpetuate a self-fulfilling prophecy. I'm going to talk briefly about an interview. Several research have been undertaken on how self-fulfilling prophecies manifest in interviews. When the interview subject is seen to be more or less qualified than others, on the one hand, bringing in an attractive woman increases the interviewer's likelihood of being courteous and pleasant to the interview subject. The interviewee responds positively to the warm energy and open body language, and as a result performs well throughout the conversation. One well-known study presented in The Nonverbal Mediation of Self-Fulfilling Prophecies and Interracial Interactions placed white and African American interview subjects in front of white interviewers. When the researchers saw the interviewers speaking with white and African American participants, they noted substantial disparities in body language. On average, African American candidates were interviewed for 25% less time than white prospects. This study was done in 1974, but considering the ongoing vitriol against minority groups and women, it still strikes an uneasy chord today. So I'm going to give you examples of self-fulfilling prophecies. The first example is the Great Depression. How powerful is a self-fulfilling prophecy? It is possible that it will produce depression or a recession, affecting the lives of everyone in the country. You might wonder how. Fears of a recession influence how people manage their money. In the event of a recession, customers may save their money and spend less. Even if the average consumer spends 5% less than they did previously, projections indicate that a country's overall GDP might fall by 3.5%. And during the Great Depression, many withdrew all of their money from banks out of fear of them failing. As we all know, banks were unable to handle such drastic shifts and eventually crashed. The second example of a self-fulfilling prophecy is marriage material. A self-fulfilling prophecy might also influence who you end up spending your life with. When you start a relationship, you may have some expectations about how it will progress or how the individual will fit into your life. You can glance at someone and think they're perfect for marriage. You then date them, be patient with them, and work hard to maintain your relationship with them. The person senses that you are serious, and if they believe you are also marriage material, they will respond with the same level of dedication to the relationship. However, it can also work in the opposite direction. The opposite may occur. If you assume someone is only a fling, you are less inclined to date or court them and take the relationship seriously. And that sends a message to the other individual, making them less likely to stick around. Example number 3 is Oedipus. The Oedipus complex is not an example of a self-fulfilling prophecy, but the story of Oedipus is. And there are numerous great stories, myths, and other references to self-fulfilling prophecies. But if you're unfamiliar with the story of Oedipus, here's a simple overview. Oedipus is born, and his father is informed that he is destined to murder his father and marry his mother. It's strange, I know, but when Oedipus' father hears the news, he abandons him and leaves him to die, preventing his destiny from being fulfilled. Anyway, Oedipus is discovered by another family and learns about his tragic fate. So, in order to avoid killing his father, who raised him rather than his biological father, he abandons his adopted family. Shortly later, he has a battle with his real father and murders him. Then he marries the man's widow, who he soon discovers is his mother. The prophecy was fulfilled. Fairy tales, 1001 Night stories, and Macbeth stories all feature self-fulfilling prophecies. Of course, they are works of fiction, but they nonetheless serve to comment on the real-world phenomena of self-fulfilling prophecy. I have another example for you: hockey. Did you know that 40% of the best hockey players are born between January and March? And there's an explanation for why this happens. It has to do with self-fulfilling prophecies. In Canada, hockey clubs begin cutting off age groups on January 1st. So children born in January through March are months older than children born in April through December. A child born in January can be nearly a year older than a child born in December. And when you're still growing, those 11 months can make a significant difference, particularly in body size. Well, children born between January and March are considerably more likely to be larger and taller than younger children, giving them a significant advantage. Because of this advantage, coaches are more likely to begin to focus on them and provide additional practice. All of that extra attention pays off, according to one theory, which explains why hockey players born between January and March are far more likely to enter professional leagues. Finally, there is something else I'd want to teach you. It's known as the Pygmalion effect. So, academics investigated the concept of a self-fulfilling prophecy, commonly known as the Pygmalion effect. The earliest Pygmalion effect experiments were conducted in the 1960s by Robert Rosenthal and Lenore Jacobson. Rosenthal and Jacobson chose a set of students at random and informed their teachers that they had been assigned a special test. The results of the exam revealed that the youngsters were growth spurters. In actuality, the test scores did not necessarily indicate that the pupils stood out among their peers, but the teachers were unaware of this. Anyway, at the conclusion of the year, the researchers evaluated how the students performed. Those that were regarded as growth drivers improved significantly over the year. They were much smarter and performed much better on the examinations. So what's remarkable about this study is that the youngsters were unaware of the test's stated outcomes. Only the teachers knew about it. And this demonstrated that the teachers' belief in their students served as a catalyst for their progress. So think about that for a minute. Your teacher's perceptions of you played a significant role in your academic progress during childhood. How insane is that? That seems ludicrous to me. Anyway, moving on, the Pygmalion effect is beneficial in studies such as the one with the growth spurters. Consider how the reverse Pygmalion effect occurs in everyday life when media, such as the news and movies, portray one group of people as violent. How might that influence how you treat them or how they perceive themselves? How may self-fulfilling prophecies be formed when important personalities claim that a group of people is less deserving of rights or is fundamentally greedy? Everything comes back to that. The students were not involved in the previously described study, but they were influenced. So reflect on your own life. What prejudices, judgments, or attitudes might be preventing you from succeeding? And how can you change your beliefs, followed by your actions, to have a greater beneficial impact on your life and eventually the lives of others? Did you know that hazing has caused at least one death per year since 1972? For many fraternities and sororities, hazing is a ritual. It frequently includes excessive drinking, strenuous physical activity, and occasionally nasty activities. But how can it occur so frequently? You can't picture any of these people being part in a hazing that could result in someone's death, or any of the victims drinking so much alcohol by themselves. Individuals do not haze themselves, but membership in an organization, particularly a fraternity or sorority, can significantly alter a person's conduct. Many hazing rituals require a certain level of de-individualization, as defined by psychologists. De-individualization may cause people to do or say things they would not typically do outside of a group setting. It can be extremely deadly in fraternities, sororities, religious organizations, or during political protests. But not all de-individualization is harmful or aggressive. This video defines de-individualization and explains what it means for those working in large corporations. Staying conscious of de-individualization and how it affects your thoughts might help you keep a strong sense of self even in crowded situations. Hey everyone, it's Knowle, your gateway to understanding human behavior and emotions. Join us for fascinating insights. Hit subscribe for a part of our journey through the exciting field of psychology. What is de-individualization? De-individualization is a process in which an individual loses their sense of self when in a community. They identify with the group's thinking, even if it differs from their own. These people lose the ability to separate from the group and evaluate their behaviors, feelings, beliefs, and conduct. Instead, the behaviors, sentiments, ideas, and behavior of the group are adopted by the individual, and they begin to act in line with the group. You might be wondering how this happens. There are several reasons why people lose their sense of self, particularly when surrounded by a large group. The first phenomenon is known as the bystander effect, or diffusion of culpability. So who is accountable for putting a halt to a huge group's aggressive behavior? Many people ask this question. In a large group, who is accountable for intervening or assisting someone who may be in distress? One could argue that everyone bears that obligation, so why should you act if someone else will help? The distribution of responsibility is a type of attribution in which others believe that someone else should be accountable for taking action. Perhaps you believe the guy next to you is more responsible because he is bigger or stronger. Perhaps the person closest to two persons fighting should be accountable for breaking it up, based on the law of proximity. The more individuals you see in a crowd, the more people you can assign your responsibilities to. This is a major concern. Second, we have anonymity. When you stand alone, others can only recognize you for who you are. However, when you're in a throng, you may believe you've lost that option. You are instead labeled as a member of the crowd. With anonymity and no responsibility, you may act in ways you would not typically do if you knew you were being held accountable. The third reason is suggestibility. So when people are unsure what to say or do, the first thing they do is look to those around them. So, in or out of a throng, they let others fill in the blanks. This suggestibility may cause you to remember things inaccurately, alter your mind about what you believe, or act in specific ways. And in a crowd, you may see numerous people explicitly or indirectly urging that you believe something or act in a particular way. And it's hard not to believe it when so many people say so. So there are three possible grounds for individualization: responsibility distribution, anonymity, and suggestibility. I want to discuss the history of de-individualization, as these concepts are not new to the field of social psychology. In 1895, a French psychologist released a book titled The Crowd. According to the book, when people create a crowd, the mob's thoughts take over, much like a spreading virus, and everyone is swept away. He also claimed that the crowd's mentality is intellectually weak, emotional, and reduces people to a more primal level. It's similar to the only as strong as the weakest point concept, in that everyone in the audience can get engaged. The author Gustave Le Bon and his work prompted numerous psychiatrists to expand on these ideas. However, it wasn't until 1952 that the phrase de-individualization was coined. Leon Festinger, Albert Pepitone, and Theodore Newcomb are widely regarded as the first to create the phrase de-individualization. They built on Le Bon's theories, laying the groundwork for the modern concept of de-individualization. Moving forward in 1969, Philip Zimbardo proposed that usually constrained behavior didn't always result in hazing or political violence. He brought in the concept of de-individualization to include more positive examples, which I'll get to in a moment. Of course, Zimbardo is not entirely responsible for beneficial outcomes. And if you've seen my video on the Stanford prison experiment, you may recall that Zimbardo oversaw the entire experiment. If you haven't watched it yet, I highly recommend watching it following this video. As with other notions in social psychology, scholars have continued to define and extend the concept of de-individualization in order to fit it into a constantly changing reality. And now I'd like to provide some examples of individualization. And I began talking about fraternities. Not all forms of de-individualization include hazing, violence, or Greek letters. You may have had personal experience with some of these cases. Consider running a marathon, for instance. Not every runner in the race is capable of or willing to run 26.2 miles at once. However, amid a large crowd, everyone's adrenaline is rushing, and the runners are extremely eager to cross the finish line. It may be easier to push your concerns and fears aside and simply keep running with the pack. The same can be said for a long day of volunteering. If you're alone, you might be less likely to plant a few dozen trees in the woods or give a dozen meals to the homeless. But when you're in a group, it doesn't feel like work. It's more inspiring to go out with a group of individuals who are determined to brave the weather or serve others all day. Of course, de-individualization can occur in religious organizations. You may go to feed the hungry with your religious group, or in extreme situations, you may even go to battle to defend your religious principles. When you have a community of followers rationalizing your acts, it is very simple to become engrossed in increasingly extreme ideas and behaviors. De-individualization is a broad term, although it is not limited to cults or fraternities, and it does not always result in negative consequences. However, the more you understand and are aware of this process, the easier it will be to step away when something goes against your personal principles. Stay mindful, observant, and grounded in your beliefs, even if you're amid a mob of depersonalized people who may be acting differently. There is nothing quite like crossing the finish line of a marathon, a 10-miler, or a 5K. You've been jogging for a long time and you may be sore, but everyone is cheering you on. Even the most weary runners benefit from the extra support, which allows them to go a little faster and finish the race. Social psychologists in the 1800s were aware of this occurrence. They wanted to see if people performed better in front of an audience or in groups. Are you likely to save a few minutes of your time when you run with others? The answers, as well as the subsequent research, form the basis of social facilitation theory. Social facilitation theory is no longer the same as it was in the 1800s, but it is one of the oldest theories in the field of social psychology. This video explains social facilitation theory and how you may utilize it to improve your performance. Let's start with some of the first studies from the 1800s. Norman Triplett, a social psychologist, discovered that cyclists fared better while riding in groups rather than alone. He next chose to test his notion of social facilitation in the laboratory. Hey everyone, it's Knowle, your gateway to understanding human behavior and emotions. Join us for fascinating insights. Hit subscribe for a part of our journey through the exciting field of psychology. Experts believe that this may be the first social psychology experiment in the study's history. The study asked children to wind some fishing line. It's a rather basic process. Some children worked independently, while others finished the activity in front of another child. Triplett noticed that youngsters who were among others worked quicker. Triplett did not name this occurrence as social facilitation until more than 30 years later, in the 1920s. As studies progressed, psychologists learned that it doesn't merely assist someone accomplish a task while another person does the same activity. Whether they are in front of a co-actor or an audience, the person is more likely to perform well. It would be a mistake to just cite an example from the 1800s and move on. The method we did tests 2 centuries ago is substantially different from the way we do them today. As psychologists continue to test and retest their beliefs, they frequently discover conflicting facts. This truly happened in social facilitation research. It took more than 40 years for a social facilitation study to challenge our understanding of the phenomenon. In 1933, a psychologist called Joseph Pessin assigned subjects a list of words to memorize. Some finished the task in groups, while others worked alone. If social facilitation theory were to apply, everybody in the group should be able to recite more of the phrases they had memorized correct. However, that is not what occurred. People who completed the activity in groups performed much worse than those who did it alone. the study contradicted the concept of social facilitation theory. But what does this signify for the work that Norman Triplett and other psychologists have done on this idea? Let us now discuss activation theory and how it relates to social facilitation, as these two ideas were later combined by psychologists such as James Michaels and Robert Zhejiang. These two psychologists worked separately but collaborated to develop activation theory within the social facilitation phenomenon. Throughout their experiments, they discovered that the difficulty of the task determined whether or not social facilitation occurred. Here's where things get interesting. If the activity was simple or the participants were proficient at it, they performed better in front of others. This phenomena is still referred to as social facilitation. On the other hand, if the task was difficult or the participants were inexperienced in it, they were more likely to perform well when they were alone. Adding more people to the mix causes them to perform worse. This is actually referred to as social inhibition. Social facilitation and social inhibition are explored together under the broad umbrella of social facilitation theory. I know there are a lot of words, but I hope I can clarify them for you. Let's speak a little more about other elements that can influence performance, because merely being among other people may not be enough to help you do much better on a task. Psychologists have various beliefs regarding what motivates us, impacts us, and really helps us perform better. One hypothesis is that the pressure to do well for others influences our performance. If you've ever been afraid to give a speech in front of an audience, you understand the pressure I'm talking about. For some, this type of pressure might be beneficial, especially if you are experienced at public speaking. Now, folks in the crowd may have an impact on our performance. Statistically, teams win more games when they play at home. One argument is that they perform better because they are more familiar with and appreciate the supporters in the stands. Of course, the familiarity of the locker room and proximity to family may also help athletes relax or concentrate better on the game. Finally, in this video, I want to discuss how you can use social facilitation theory to help you achieve. There isn't a single formula for success, but social facilitation theory can take us in the right way. If you have a goal, try experimenting with how co-actors or an audience can help you achieve it. You may join a running or cycling club. If you've been practicing guitar, consider signing up to perform at an open mic night. I strongly recommend employing an accountability partner to help you stay on track. Including others in your path can help you perform better and achieve your goals faster. However, if you do not perform well in front of others, it may simply suggest that you need to practice more alone. You are not awful at the task. You simply need to improve your skills and get more comfortable before beginning to perform in front of others, and ideally better. If you want to learn more about minority influence and how it works, you must first understand what happened on August 18, 1920. That was the day the 19th Amendment was ratified, granting women the right to vote. Again, in 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed. In 2015, the Supreme Court overturned the ban on same-sex marriage. These are some of the most significant events in American history. These moments introduced more individuals to the concept of the American dream. Of course, these changes did not occur overnight. Years of discrimination preceded these developments. Many people were imprisoned or even killed for exercising their right to protest these concerns and promote equality for everyone. At times in American history, same-sex marriages and women's suffrage appeared inconceivable. So how did this happen? How did the minority opinion, such as the belief that all races deserve equal rights, prevail against the majority at the time? Sergei Moscovici, a Romanian-French psychologist, posed himself these questions in the 1960s and 1970s. His minority influence hypothesis demonstrated how a tiny group of individuals might impact the opinions of the masses. And this video focuses on that minority influence and how it compares to prior majority influence theories. Hey everyone, it's Knowle, your gateway to understanding human behavior and emotions. Join us for fascinating insights. Hit subscribe for a part of our journey through the exciting field of psychology. But before I get into minority impact, I believe it is crucial to discuss the theories that came before Moscovici's work. Solomon Asch was a Polish-American psychologist who researched something called conformance. He demonstrated how people were more prone to conform to the dominant perspective in order to fit in, even if truth contradicted it. Individuals gradually conformed. It was more crucial to stick to the plan and not upset anyone. These were crucial research, although this concept dates back to evolutionary psychology. People who lived in smaller communities or tribes had to rely on the rest of the group to provide them with food, housing, and protection. People were protected as long as they belonged to a group that helped them stay safe. Any unpredictable conduct or going against the grain posed a threat to that individual's safety, and we continue to sense the discomfort of being rejected from a group and the perils of isolation. So compliance is the process of adhering to the majority opinion, and normative influence is the influence that the majority exerts over others. However, this film does not end with Asch's views on compliance and experiments on obedience. We are all aware that, while normative influence is significant, it is not the only social impact that exists. If we had simply been convinced by the majority, we would never have been able to pass legislation enabling same-sex weddings or granting ethnic minorities the right to vote. Minority organizations such as the Nazis would never have risen to power. So Moscovici began doing his own experiments. He questioned Asch's beliefs about conformity. Interestingly, Asch agreed that minority influence needed to be investigated. Moscovici discovered that while conformity leads people to believe the majority perspective, another process can also occur. This procedure is known as conversion. A minority can persuade others to adopt their viewpoints. However, as previously said, this process takes time. Often, people silently convert to minority thinking before becoming vocal and proud of their beliefs. It's vital to note that in this video, I'm discussing the psychological process behind this thought. To be effective, a minority movement must have a precise set of traits. Without these features, the movement is likely to fail, with normative influence outweighing minority influence. So let's discuss some of the characteristics of minority influence. Moscovici discovered that a minority group must possess the following qualities or characteristics in order to exert influence over the majority. There are 4 of them. Number 1 is a consistent behavioral style. Number 2 is the opportunity for systematic thought. Flexibility comes in third, followed by identification. So let's discuss behavioral style, specifically consistency and confidence. When a minority opinion enters a discussion, it can be difficult to understand at first. What is their message? What is their goal? What are they really fighting for? Consistent replies to these questions increase the likelihood of conversion. In fact, Moscovici believed that consistency was the most important characteristic of a minority movement. Without consistency, it's easy to write off the movement as disorganized. It's easy to poke holes in the minority's arguments. See, our brains don't like confusion, and we're not likely to be converted to something that confuses us. So consistency is the most important part of a movement's behavioral style. In order for minority influence to take place, the movement should also be confident, appear to be unbiased, and resist the current movement and its pressure on society. Secondly, we have systematic thinking. So, as you probably know, it's very easy to go along with the majority opinion. There are tons of experiments that prove this. If everyone around you believes that something is true, you're likely not to question it. You may not dig even deeper for the ins and outs of your own opinion because no one is questioning you about your views. This is called superficial thinking. Now, one of the reasons that minority influence takes hold is because it goes beyond superficial thinking. When a minority opinion is introduced, people are more likely to mull it over, to think about it. They may debate the merits of the opinion and how it stacks up to the majority opinion. With a consistent message, it's easier for people to engage in systematic thinking. I know this all seems really complicated, but it's very interesting to me. This type of understanding can help people become more confident in their views. People are more likely to engage in discussions and actually have debates about what they believe if they've gone through the process of systematic thinking. Third, we have something called flexibility. So consistency is not the same as rigidity. In order to influence people, the minority opinion may need to be flexible in what they accept and what others will accept. After all, change in a nation happens usually with small steps. At the time that gay marriage was legalized throughout the United States, over a dozen states had already legalized it. People were still coming around to the idea of same-sex marriage, but all of those smaller conversions were still considered a win. Radical change usually does not happen overnight, especially with nations. If minority movements are willing to be flexible and accept smaller wins, then in the long run, they're more likely to see a big win in the future. Lastly, we have identification. As we see more and more people that identify with siding with the minority, we begin to open up our minds to that opinion. If a random person on the street who didn't look like you or didn't appear to be from your city came up to you with the idea that chewing gum should be illegal, you'd probably write them off as just a weird, strange person on the street. However, if your parents maybe said the same thing, you might at least hear them out. So let's go back to the idea of evolutionary psychology. You should know humans have always had an us versus them mindset. They support and protect the members of their own group. We call them us, while pushing away the people from the other group. We call them them. Even if we don't know someone in our own group, we're still likely to support them because they're part of the us group. We identify with others in many ways. We identify with people of the same sex, the same gender, social class, or even hometown. When those similar people come to us with an opinion or an idea, because of psychology, we are much more likely to hear them out and maybe see their side of it. But this video is coming to an end, so let's wrap it up. These 4 characteristics make it easier for a minority movement to influence others. If you have a wild idea or find yourself wanting to go against the grain, it might be helpful to see how these 4 characteristics can help you change the world. Have you ever worked on a collaborative project and felt like you were doing all the work? If you're here, you may have a research paper or homework assignment with the term social loafing. But don't worry, after seeing this video, you should have a thorough grasp of what social loafing is, how it works, and what precise steps you can take to prevent it. So what is social loafing? Social loafing happens when an individual works less hard in a group than they would if they were working alone. Maximilian Ringelmann discovered it in 1913, when he observed that collective pulling power in a tug-of-war game was smaller than the sum of individual powers. In reality, as the number of participants in the tug-of-war game increased, the average contribution declined. This pattern shows that members put forth less effort as the group size increases. This viewpoint undermines the notion that putting people in teams motivates them to perform harder. This has the potential to induce palpitations throughout a human resources team. This, however, is only half the truth, as I'll demonstrate in the remainder of this video. So let's go over some instances quickly so you can gain a better understanding of it. Here's a brief example: tug of war, group school projects, and an entertainment asking the crowd to yell are all forms of social loafing. Because as more people join the group, the overall group effort decreases. So tug of war is an excellent example because it is where Maximilian Ringelmann discovered it. He observed that as the number of individuals in a tug of war game increased, the amount of pressure did not scale perfectly. In fact, as the number of individuals increased, each individual worked less. Group homework projects are another excellent example. We've all seen the meme in which one student does all the work while the others receive the grade. Those that do not contribute to the effort are considered social loafers. Have you ever been to a performance or event when the main speaker urges the crowd to stand up, yell something, or clap? This is an ideal area for social loafing. A speaker may even say, "That wasn't loud enough." Surprisingly, the same behavior happens during tug of war. As more people join the gathering, they are less likely to participate in whatever the speaker asks them to do. So after the examples, let's look at the psychology of social loafing. What causes it? Team members begin social loafing when they believe they will not achieve anything and hence conclude that their involvement is optional. So here are the 2 main factors psychologists have discovered that contribute to social loafing. The first one is a loss of personal responsibility. Ringelmann's experiment with a tug-of-war team demonstrated how personal responsibility appears to dissipate as team size increases. The top sports team coaches achieve incredible outcomes by keeping their team together and motivating individual players, as well as the entire squad. It is also critical for these coaches to understand their team's demands so that whenever they require space, they can provide it to allow each player to let off steam. The second cause of social loafing is a lack of belief in the worth of one's contributions. So, if a team member believes their contribution will be insignificant, particularly in a much larger team context, they may decide to back off and enjoy the ride at the expense of the other members of the team. This is one of the primary reasons why many of us don't volunteer for projects or take on leadership roles. We really don't think we have anything to contribute. It's also possibly why half of the American population does not vote in presidential elections. In many circumstances, the person who is loafing may be unaware of it. I'd also want to add another frequent feature, the split of members into in-groups and out-groups. This is typical for school tasks, but I believe it can be found anywhere in the world today. In the final half of this video, I'd like to share some strategies for managing social loafing with a little incentive. So there are 3 strategies to move a group in the proper direction. These tactics include collaboration, content, and choice. And while it may sound strange, psychologists have devised this solution. This concept appears to encourage a collaborative dynamic, making it a healthier alternative to increasing rivalry. It's vital to remember that this works best during group practices. So the first one is collaboration, which means that each team member has a specific meaningful task. For example, the worst social loafer can be assigned to keep meeting minutes and distribute them so that they have no place to hide, so to speak. The idea here is to have each member of your group accomplish something, and if they don't, hold them accountable. Second, we have substance, which refers to the significance of a team member's role and how well it matches their personal characteristics. For example, a person who enjoys socializing could be an excellent leader for a brainstorming session, and assigning duties based on each person's skill set is a terrific motivator. It allows each individual a chance to shine. Finally, we have choices. Choice is equally essential because it confers ownership on the person making the decision. Excessive social loafing will be less appealing to them because they will have more pressing responsibilities. Essentially, the third option allows each person to choose what they wish to accomplish. So, in essence, cooperation is keeping everyone accountable. Content is allowing individuals to do what they do best, and choice is allowing them to do whatever they want. To summarize, regulating social loafing aims to improve the soft, non-task aspects of group functioning. Collaboration, content, and choice, as I previously discussed, give an excellent framework for group leaders to manage. I believe that merely recalling one of these can help someone handle social loafing. However, groups should self-optimize from the bottom up rather than being driven from the top. This means that teams function far better when each individual member is motivated to do what they want, how they want, rather than having one person at the top instructing them what to do. If I've learned anything from studying psychology, it's that people are captivated by it. We all want to understand why people do what they do. We want to be able to explain the conduct of our friends, family, lovers, co-workers, and even strangers. In fact, we try to explain human behavior without realizing it. Have you ever tried to study the conduct of the man your friend is dating? Or perhaps you spotted someone sprinting in public and assumed he must be fleeing the police. Perhaps your colleague is acting strangely, and you suspect they're hiding something from me. Humans are meaning-making animals. While psychologists try to understand and explain behavior, they also want to know how humans try to comprehend and explain behavior. This technique is known as attribution. There are numerous ways in which people rationalize their actions, as well as the mistakes they make along the road. It could be just as informative as the underlying reasons for the conduct. So I'd like to explain briefly about something called attribution theory. Fritz Heider, a Gestalt psychologist, introduced attribution to psychology in the early 20th century. Although he did not go into great detail on the attribution process, he did describe 2 distinct forms of attribution that are still widely studied in attribution theory today: dispositional and situational attribution. Dispositional attribution, also known as internal attribution, occurs when you assume a person's action is motivated by internal reasons. For example, a person may cry on the subway because they are emotionally unstable, or they cry frequently. In either case, it is related to the individual's internal elements. Second, we have situational attribution, also known as external attribution, which occurs when you assume a person's behavior is influenced by external factors. Maybe you see the same person crying on the same metro, but you presume it's because of something outside of their control. Perhaps they witnessed something horrible, or they were just broken up with by the person sitting next to them on the subway. Either technique could provide the correct answer, but attribution focuses on how people arrive at these judgments. According to ideas on actor-observer bias, we are more prone to utilize internal or external attribution depending on whether we are performing the activity or viewing it. Next, I'd want to discuss something called correspondent inference theory. Some attribution theories focus solely on dispositional attribution. Consider Jones and Davis's correspondent inference theory. Jones and Davis argue that humans are more inclined to employ internal attribution in certain scenarios. If someone acts freely and consciously, we are more likely to connect their actions to their personality. We explain that it is simply the type of person they are. Other characteristics that may prompt us to create internal attributions include if the conduct is uncommon, directed at a specific individual, or has the potential to directly damage or aid another person. So suppose you're strolling down the street and hear someone bothering you. It's not normal behavior, and it's geared at you. It checks off two of these items from the list. You believe that street harassment is done to provoke a negative reaction from individuals. You are more prone to relate the harasser's behavior to their personality rather than some external stimulus. In summary, this theory helps you comprehend whether a person is doing something because of who they are or because of the circumstances surrounding them. Next, I'd like to discuss Kelly's covariation model, because attribution theory extends beyond the correspondent inference theory. Harold Kelly developed a model that is now considered one of the most well-known attribution theories. Kelly's covariation model argues that three elements influence whether we utilize internal or external attribution. So imagine you're at a dinner party and your friend orders a really expensive champagne on a night out with your other buddies. You may be wondering if this is because they prefer the finer things in life, or if external influences in their current situation are inspiring them. Kelly provides three particular factors that you can utilize to determine the answer. The first one is consensus. So consensus refers to how everyone else behaves in the same situation. You may look at what everyone else is ordering. If everyone at the table orders pricey cocktails and caviar, there indicates a high level of unanimity. However, if everyone sticks to inexpensive appetizers and alcohol, unanimity is unlikely. Second, we have individuality. Here's how your friend behaves in similar situations. Assume your friend consistently orders the fanciest item on the menu or purchases the most expensive clothes at the mall. If they do, the distinctiveness is modest. However, if they like to conserve money, shop at thrift stores, or eat at less expensive places, their individuality is high. We're simply stating that your friend's purchase of a really pricey bottle of champagne is distinctive. Third, we have consistency. And this is how your friend always behaves in this case. Maybe your friend likes to buy costly champagne. When you're out with this particular friend group or at this precise restaurant. If so, there is a high level of consistency. However, if this is the first time your friend has opted to purchase really expensive beverages for your buddies, we would conclude that consistency is lacking. If you notice that your friend's behavior falls on the low end of the range on all three of these, you're more likely to ascribe it to your friend's personality. You respond, that's simply who they are. They're just a showy person who appreciates the finest things in life. However, if your friend's behavior is on the extreme end of the range, you are more likely to blame it on outside influences. Perhaps your friend feels they made a negative impression when they first met those buddies and wants to make amends. Perhaps they received a raise, or they were disappointed by some terrible news, and they simply want to make the evening special. Of course, we cannot always apply this approach to strangers. As with anything in psychology, if a stranger orders really costly champagne, you can't just look at their entire shopping history or who they're with. In this scenario, Kelly proposes that they consider previous experiences and assign necessary and sufficient explanations to the person's action. People do it all the time. You might believe that a stranger's nice outfit means he's a high roller. Again, these attributions and our understanding of attribution theory do not necessarily reflect the underlying motivations driving a person's conduct. We're all aware that smoking is unhealthy for us. This is a message that has been pounded into us since we entered elementary school. Cigarettes are harmful. They will murder you. They will give you lung cancer. You understand all of these messages just as well as I do. So why do over 30 million American adults still smoke? Why is vaping still a popular method of consuming nicotine? Why is smoking still considered a trend? Why haven't we entirely stopped smoking? Part of the answer is that nicotine is so addictive that it grips smokers. Quitting is difficult, but it is possible. But we would be naive to ignore the psychological processes that occur when someone picks up a cigarette, especially if they are aware that it is unhealthy for them. Sure, some smokers pick up cigarettes or jewelry with the purpose of injuring themselves, but the majority do not. They are at a crossroads known as cognitive dissonance. The unpleasantness of being at this crossroads frequently encourages the smoker to continue smoking. Thus, cognitive dissonance does not only occur when you light up a cigarette. We encounter cognitive dissonance whether we read the news, drive a car, or push ourselves to sleep at night. And in this video, I'll explain what cognitive dissonance is and how it affects the mind. The better you understand this process, the easier it will be to make informed decisions in the future, which may include quitting smoking. First and foremost, what is cognitive dissonance? Leon Festinger published a theory of cognitive dissonance in 1957, defining the term as a feeling of mental pain caused by having two different beliefs or values simultaneously. This discomfort may also occur when we are forced to act in a way that contradicts our beliefs. The mind prefers uncomplicated things. It also prefers consistency. And if you have two contradictory views, such as I want to live a long life and I want to smoke a cigarette, the mind will not be at ease. So what does the mind do? It makes every possible effort to alleviate the suffering. So here's the most significant thing Festinger addressed in his book. Decreasing mental suffering can be a powerful motivator. This concept was novel at the time, but it has proven to be an intriguing explanation for many of the decisions we face on a daily basis. Now, I'd like to briefly discuss some examples of cognitive dissonance. The first one is smoking cigarettes. Obviously, Festinger utilized the cigarette smoking example to demonstrate the force of cognitive dissonance. Again, we are all aware that smoking is terrible for us, yet those who are addicted to nicotine continue to smoke or use their Juul. Festinger hypothesized that when smokers experience cognitive dissonance, they will argue with themselves to alleviate the discomfort. They will tell themselves that smoking isn't as horrible as they think, or that they don't smoke enough to cause any significant damage. They may also convince themselves that smoking is preferable to other harmful habits, or that quitting will result in other negative habits such as overeating or alcohol addiction. All of these are just reasons used to justify smoking. And to a non-smoker, these arguments don't quite match together. They obviously do not erase the reality that smoking is harmful to your health, but these are the things that people tell themselves to avoid cognitive dissonance. Another example is bogus news. We currently live in a very polarized political climate. People believe they must support one side, while the opposing side is rife with dishonesty and deception. Cognitive dissonance plays a role in this polarization. Cries of fake news are a popular method to cope with cognitive dissonance. Failing to research the present pandemic while labeling it a conspiracy is one method to alleviate the anguish of knowing that going out and partying could cost you your life or someone else's. Sure, there are a lot of false stories circulating about this information, but dismissing it as fake news just because it contradicts your present beliefs and what you want to do is a sort of cognitive dissonance reduction. Another example is peer pressure. This approach may also explain why people remain in relationships, organizations, or occupations that are not in their best interests. Peer pressure can induce a significant sense of cognitive dissonance. Sometimes it's easier to follow the herd, especially if it's a cult. Studies have proved that this is correct. In one study, participants were asked to determine whether two lines were the same length or different. 75% of the time, everyone in the group, including the study's actors, provided a clearly incorrect answer. The individual they were studying did the same thing, appearing to simply follow along with the others. Moving on, cognitive dissonance is potent, which is why you should be aware of it. With this knowledge, you can become more conscious of how you make judgments and whether or not you're allowing your discomfort to get the best of you. Now, discomfort is unavoidable whether you're acquiring new knowledge, hearing other people's viewpoints, or making difficult judgments. It's just going to happen. However, now that you understand what cognitive dissonance is, you can be on the watch for it. To gain awareness of your thoughts and feelings, you may need to practice mindfulness. The more in tune you are with your body, mind, and emotions, the easier it will be to detect discomfort. If you understand the source of your discomfort, you'll be less inclined to succumb to it. Allow yourself to feel uncomfortable when someone challenges your beliefs. Take the time to study claims you read online rather than dismissing them as fake news. Step back from any decisions you may have made as a result of peer pressure. Cognitive dissonance is intended to keep things simple, but it can lead to a disastrous situation if you make the wrong judgment. You've probably heard the expression, if all of your friends jumped off a bridge, would you do it too? If you did not hear it from your own parents, you most likely heard it from parents on television. It's a question designed to make students stop and consider the power of peer pressure. There's only one problem. People are likely to jump off a bridge after losing all of their pals. At the very least, there is a better possibility than you might expect. Conformity pushes people to discard all logic and reality. Why else would 900 people consume poisoned Kool-Aid in Jonestown? Why would individuals perpetrate such heinous actions as those during World War II and the Holocaust? In the second part of the 20th century, psychologists conducted experiments on conformity, social psychology, and obedience. The Asch line test was one of the most well-known experiments at the time. In this video, I will discuss the line test and how it demonstrates the power of peer pressure and compliance. So, the Asch line test, also known as the Asch conformity experiment, sought to determine how frequently people would forego reason in order to perform. They were carried out in the 1950s by a psychologist called Solomon Asch. Asch led individual participants into a room full of Confederates, which are essentially performers. To assess the group's vision, researchers asked a series of questions. Of course, the Confederates or actors were present during the experiments and responded to Asch's questions as instructed. One of these vision tests involved looking at a line on one side of the board and 3 lines on the other, designated A, B, and C. One of the lines had the same length as the individual line, while the others were significantly longer or shorter. Asch answered a series of questions to determine which lines were the same length as the individual lines. This was not a difficult test. It was quite basic. Asch ran tests in which participants had to guess which line had the same length without the influence of anyone else. Participants replied correctly 99% of the time, matching the appropriate lines. He then conducted research to demonstrate that when people can make and share decisions privately, they are less likely to conform. Sometimes the group answered properly, but not always. Asch directed the Confederates to confidently select the incorrect response. It was typically evident that the response was incorrect, yet none of the actors batted an eye. The participant would then have to make a decision. Would they trust their instincts, choose the correct answer, and answer individually from the group, or would they succumb to peer pressure and select the incorrect response? These responses left little opportunity for argument because they were rather straightforward. However, 75% of participants answered erroneously at least once in order to fit in with the group. That is a large number of people giving the incorrect response in order to conform to the majority. When all of Asch's studies were merged and the data was collated, researchers discovered that 33% of the time, participants simply went with the flow. This is mind-boggling in psychology. Now let's speak about the elements that influence the experiment, because while this is one of the most well-known studies in social psychology, it is far from flawless. Asch conducted over a dozen studies, and the types of participants did not vary significantly. The majority of participants were male Swarthmore College students. Perhaps their gender or education influences whether they conform to the group. Perhaps the Confederates they chose, the players, had an impact. According to more recent research on conformity, the peers who are pressuring others may have an impact on compliance. If a participant identifies with the Confederates in the group, they may be more likely to follow group norms. But let's zoom out even further. The study was carried out in the United States of America in the 1950s. Many psychologists speculated that the time period may have influenced the findings, as the students in the study were likely aware of the Red Scare and McCarthyism tactics used to blacklist people for supposed communist activities. McCarthy's inquiry did not involve any reasoning. People who did not adapt to America's economic ideals risked losing their jobs and dignity. In summary, there was a lot of pressure to conform across the country. But as we move forward, why do we conform? All of these variables, as well as the effects, cause you to question why we conform. The Asch line test is commonly used to support the concept of normative social influence. Participants are encouraged to conform to the group in order to avoid social punishment. They don't want to be perceived as an outsider. We discussed this extensively in our in-group and out-group bias videos. Critics of this theory contend that the desire is purely to escape punishment rather than to conform. They regard these two different things as separate judgments. Another type of influence is informational influence, which occurs when someone believes that the group is more knowledgeable than they are. While this may not have occurred during the Asch line trials, it is more likely that normative social influence was the cause. After all, it seemed rather evident which line was the best decision. I mean, you can examine it yourself. Solomon Asch's conformity experiments date back over 60 years. Psychologists from all across the world have replicated these findings. Since then, academics have evaluated a variety of characteristics, including gender, nationality, culture, and age. In many of these tests, the majority of individuals followed the group at least once. Conformity occurred, but with a limited number of individuals each time. Jumping off a bridge is significantly different from deciding one line is the same length as another, but peer pressure can impact a person's decision. So the next time you find yourself going against your instincts, consider this Asch line test. Do you feel you could be wrong, or do you simply want to fit in with the group? I believe that one significant takeaway from this experiment is that you should speak up whenever you believe you are thinking differently from others. I feel communication is a critical takeaway from this experiment, as Asch stated in one of the experiments. When all of the Confederates could speak, they grew more convinced that the participant was correct. Consider an instance when you were upset. And I don't simply mean when you're irritated with a coworker or frustrated with someone in traffic. Think about a time when you were extremely angry. If you can't think of anyone who has gotten particularly furious at you, remember that anger is a typical human emotion, but it may swiftly escalate. Anger over a parking penalty can swiftly lead to a broken mirror. A simple quarrel at the pub could escalate into a brawl. Wearing the incorrect jersey in the wrong place might be dangerous. But why is this happening? Why do we allow ourselves to become so violent, even over minor issues? These episodes of great rage may feel uncontrollable. People who are angry may black out and commit activities that they would not have done otherwise. Certain states enable passion to be used as a defense technique in court. Is this human nature or something that can be managed and eliminated? So there isn't just one answer. Psychologists have three major theories of aggressiveness that aim to explain why humans become aggressive and whether it is possible to change that behavior. These theories include the impulse theory of aggression, the frustrated aggression theory, and a concept known as social learning theory. This video will quickly discuss all three of these ideas of aggression, where they came from, and how they relate to our daily behaviors and attitudes. So first, let's look at the instinct explanation of violence. The original theory of aggression dates back to the days of Sigmund Freud. Freud's theory of conduct altered throughout time. At first, he thought that all behaviors flowed from eros, the life instinct. These were the instincts that kept us alive and eager to procreate. However, he concluded in 1920 that the life instinct could not account for all of our behavioral drives. Aggression, you see, does not always match with our urge to survive and keep others alive. So Freud wrote about Thanatos in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. He gave this moniker to something he referred to as the death instinct. The death instinct helped to explain why humans become angry, engage in hazardous activities, and wish to relive previous tragedies. Freud argued that these two instincts, eros and thanatos, coexist in every human mind and that all behaviors result from a balance of these two inclinations. This may explain why we take out our emotions on others, even if the anger or aggressiveness is initially focused at ourselves. Eros triumphs over thanatos in an effort to keep ourselves alive. The aggression is then turned outward. So what did Freud advise we do with these instincts? Actually, not much. He argued that attempting to suppress anger was futile because it sprang from an intrinsic instinct profoundly ingrained in the human mind. This approach focused on building society in such a way that communities remained small in order to safeguard them. Strategies would be developed such that hostile actions may be directed outside of the society, thereby safeguarding all inside members. Next, we'll look into frustrated aggression theory. Even if you can't remember the last time you were angry with someone, I'm sure you can recall a time when they were frustrated with you. Frustration is a frequent human feeling that occurs when someone or something prevents us from achieving a goal. The aim could be as simple as completing an essay or as complex as answering life's deepest mysteries. So the frustration aggression theory simply states that aggressiveness is a result of dissatisfaction. Frustration is likely to escalate into aggression, but it does not have to if the individual has higher degrees of self-awareness or self-control. So without delving too further into this hypothesis, let us look at a study on frustrated aggressiveness theory. Aggression does not have to be directed toward the source of one's frustration. Even after the goal is attained and the frustration has subsided, the hostility may persist. In one of the first studies on frustration aggression theory, children were positioned in front of a wire screen. On the other side of the screen, there were several toys. And although the children could see the toys, they were just out of reach. They couldn't play with them. This was probably frustrating for the kids who wanted to play with the toys. However, once the wire barrier was removed and the children were permitted to play with these toys, researchers discovered that their play was more aggressive than when the barrier was not present at all. And there are several examples in your own life, as it is not difficult to connect periods of aggression with moments of frustration. Have you ever kicked or banged a door out of frustration? These are all hostile behaviors. The connection between frustration and aggressiveness appears to be obvious. But there's one more theory we need to discuss: social learning theory. The last aggressiveness theory is based on one of history's most well-known experiments. Albert Bandura proposed the social learning theory back in the 1960s. Bandura is most known for his Bobo doll experiment, which sought to explain how children learn violence at a young age. He suggested that hostility is just a learned behavior. We witness other people doing it, and children act aggressively simply because they are emulating what they have seen. So here's a brief summary of how the experiment went. Children were placed in a room with an adult, some toys, and a huge Bobo doll. And if you don't know what a Bobo doll is, it's one of those inflatable clowns that always bounces back up when hit. So half of the children in this trial sat in a room with the adult, who gently interacted with the toys and displayed very little hostility. The other half, however, sat in a room with an adult who forcefully punched or kicked the Bobo doll. Some of these individuals used explicit language or even whacked the Bobo doll on the head with a hammer. So what did we find? The children were then isolated from the adult and placed in their own room with more stimulating toys. And after a few minutes, the toys were removed on purpose to disturb the children. All of the youngsters were then led to a third room where there was a Bobo doll. Children who have watched aggressive adults were now more prone to engage in aggressive behaviors themselves. In short, the youngsters were simply imitating and modeling what they had witnessed, kicking, striking, or acting aggressively toward the Bobo doll. So based on this experiment, Bandura claimed that aggression is learned not just through positive or negative reinforcement, but also through indirect observational learning, which simply involves observing someone conduct irritation or violence. As I conclude this video, I'd want to ask you which one you believe is correct, because one of these hypotheses may make more sense than the others, or you may believe they all make sense together. There is now no correct or incorrect response to the topic of why humans become hostile. Frustration, as well as a child's death instincts, could have contributed to the Bobo doll experiment. But that's the appeal of studying psychology. There is always more to learn and questions to be answered. As we conclude, I'd like to thank you for watching. I hope you found value in this video and learned something new, and I look forward to seeing you in our future videos. I would deeply value it if you could like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support will help us to create more valuable content. What are the key takeaways from this video that you can share in the comment section?